Chapter 18 of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 18. King Stanislaus quits Alrenstadt to appease the troubles in Poland. Charles XII gives laws to the empire. A courier arrives from Paris. Horatio receives letters which give him great surprise. Augustus, being able to obtain no better conditions from the King of Sweden than leave to return to his almost ruined electorate, took leave of his conqueror with an almost broken heart. Intelligence soon after arriving that Poland was half demolished by the violence of different factions, who in the absence of both their kings contended with equal fury for the sovereign power, Stanislaus took an affectionate farewell of his dear friend and patron, and went to appease the troubles of that kingdom, and make himself peaceably acknowledged for what he was, their lawful king, not only by election, but by the gift of the conqueror, Charles XII of Sweden. He was attended by 10,000 Swedish horse, and twice the number of foot, in order to make good his claim against any of his rebellious subjects. Charles, having now accomplished all he could desire in relation to the Polish affairs, began to grow weary of the idle life he led at Alrenstadt, and was thinking which way he should turn his arms. He had been used ill by the Czar, who, as has been before observed, plotted his destruction while a minor, and began hostilities when he thought him not in a condition to defend himself, much less to make any reprisals. His resentment therefore against him was no less implacable than it had been against Augustus. But the emperor had also disobliged him. Count Zobor, the chamberlain, had taken very indecent and unbecoming liberties with his character in the presence of his own ambassador at Vienna, and that court had given shelter to 1,500 Muscovites who, having escaped his arms, fled thither for protection. As he was now so near, he therefore thought best to call the emperor first to account, and then proceed to attack the Czar. To this end he sent to demand Count Zobor and the 1,500 Muscovites should be given into his hands. The timid emperor complied with the first, and sent his chamberlain to be punished as the king thought fit. But it was not in his power to acquiesce with the other. The Roman envoy then at Vienna, having intelligence of it, provided for their escape by different routes. The King of Sweden then sent a second mandate, requiring protection for all the Lutherans throughout Germany, particularly in Silesia, and that they should be restored to all the liberties and privileges established by the Treaty of Westphalia. The emperor, who would have yielded anything to get the King of Sweden out of his neighbourhood, granted even this, disobliging as it was to the Pope and his own Catholic subjects, and having ratified these concessions, the king vouchsafed to let his chamberlain return, without any other punishment than imprisonment, so long as these affairs remained in agitation. Having thus given laws to Germany, and terror to the emperor, he resolved to turn where he might expect more opposition, and accordingly he ordered Count Piper to acquaint the officers that they must now begin to think of preparing for a march. In the meantime, ambassadors from all the courts of Europe were sent to his camp, most of them being apprehensive that they should be the next who felt the terror of his arms, but those who had nothing of this kind to dread, and more really his friends, made use of all the arguments in their power to prevail on him to return to Stockholm. France in particular sent courier after courier, remonstrating to him that his glory was complete, that he had already exceeded Alexander, and should now return, covered as he was with laurels, and let his subjects enjoy the blessing of his presence. The court of Saint-Germain added their entreaties to that of Versailles, but each were equally ineffectual, nor could even the thoughts of the beautiful Princess Louisa, his betrothed spouse, and whom he was to marry at the end of this war, put a stop to the vehemence of his impatience to revenge the many injuries he had received from the Czar of Muscovy. These were the sentiments by which this conquering monarch was agitated, but Horatio, though no less fond of glory, had a softness in his nature which made him languish for the sight of his dear Charlotta, whom he had been absent from near 2 years, and being now blessed with a fortune from the plunder of Saxony, which might countenance his pretensions to her, passionately longed for an opportunity of returning without incurring the censure of cowardice or ingratitude. By these couriers he received letters from the Baron de la Valliere and several others of his friends, but none from the father of Charlotta, nor did any of them make mention of that lady, though he knew the passion he had for her was now no secret to any of them. He was very much surprized that the Baron de Palfoy had not wrote, because as he had in a manner promised to correspond with him by desiring him to write, he had a right to expect that favour when they came to Alrenstadt, for till then it was scarce possible, by reason of the army's continual and uncertain motions. But he was much more so that the Baron de la Valliere had not been so good as to give him some information of an affair of which he could not be insensible his peace so much depended. That he did not do it, he therefore presently concluded, was owing to his having nothing pleasing to acquaint him with. As love is always apprehensive of the worst that can possibly befall, he thought now of nothing but her being obliged to give her hand to some rival approved by her father. What avails it, cried he, that fortune has raised me to an equality with her, if by other means I am deprived of her? He was beginning to give way to a despair little befitting a soldier, when another courier arriving from Versailles with dispatches to the king, he also received a packet in which were 3 letters. The first he cast his eye upon had on it the characters of Charlotta. Amazed and transported, he hastily broke the seal, and found it contained these lines: To Colonel Horatio, Sir, I have the permission of my father to pursue my inclinations. In giving you this testimony, how sincerely I congratulate your good fortune, though I ought not to call it by that name, since I find everybody allows your rewards have not exceeded your merits, but as neither has been found deficient, either for your ambition or the satisfaction of your friends, all who are truly such think you ought to be content and run no future hazards. Be assured you have many well-wishers here, among the number of which you will not be guilty of great injustice not to place Charlotta de Palfoy. How well were all the late anxieties he had endured atoned for by this billet! It was short indeed, and wrote with a more distant air than he might have expected, had the dear authoress been at liberty to pursue the dictates of her heart; but as it informed him it was permitted by her father, and was doubtless under his inspection, the knowledge that he had authorized her to write at all was more flattering to his hopes of happiness than all she could have said without that sanction. After having indulged the raptures this condescension excited, he proceeded to the rest, and found the next he opened was from the Baron de Palfoy, who expressed himself to him in these terms: To Colonel Horatio, I think myself obliged to you for so much exceeding the character I gave you, but I value myself on knowing mankind, and am glad to find I was not deceived in you, when I expected you to do more than I durst venture on my own opinion to assure the count. He tells me in a letter I received from him the last courier, that the victorious Charles XII himself cannot behave with greater bravery in the time of action, nor more moderation after it is over. This is great praise indeed from such a man as he, and I acquaint you with it not to make you vain, for that would blemish the lustre of your other good qualities, but that you may know how to make proper acknowledgments to that minister. Our court, I know, makes pressing influences to the king of Sweden not to carry on the way any farther. I wish they may succeed, or if they should not, that you might be able to find some opportunity of quitting the service, for reasons which you will see in a letter that accompanies this, and to which nothing can be added to convince you what part you ought to take. I shall therefore say no more than that I am, with a very tender regard, yours, Palfoy. Rejoiced as he was at receiving a letter from the father of his mistress, wrote in a manner which he might look upon as a kind of confirmation he no longer would be refractory to his wishes, the latter part of it contained an enigma he could by no means comprehend. It seemed impossible to him there could be any reasons prevalent enough to make him quit with honour a prince who had so liberally rewarded his service. But hoping a further explanation, he lost not any time in conjectures, and tearing open the other letter without giving himself time to examine the hand in which it was directed, found to his inexpressible astonishment the name of Dorilaus subscribed. It was indeed wrote by that gentleman, and contained as follows: Dear Horatio, accidents which at our parting neither of us could foresee have doubtless long since made you cease to hope any continuance of that kindness my former behaviour seemed to promise, but never perhaps did heaven deal its blessings with a more mysterious hand than it has done to you. That seeming neglect in me, at a time when you were a prisoner among strangers, and had most need of my assistance, had the appearance of the greatest misfortune could befall you, yet has it been productive of the greatest good, and laid the foundation of a happiness which cannot be but lasting. I reserve the explanation of this riddle till you arrive at Paris, where I now am, and intend to continue my whole life. That I impatiently desire to see you ought to be a sufficient inducement for you to return with as much expedition as possible. I will therefore make this experiment of that affection, I might add duty, you owe me, and only give you leave to guess what recompense this proof of your obedience will entitle you to. If therefore the King of Sweden is resolute to extend his conquests, entreat his permission to resign. I know the obligations you have to that excellent prince, but I know also you have others to me which cannot be dispensed with. Besides, his majesty's affairs cannot suffer by the loss of one man. Yours will be in danger, if not totally ruined, by your continuance with him, and myself deprived at the same time of the only remaining comfort of my days. Your sister left me soon after you did. She went to Aix-la-Chapelle, since which I have never been able to hear anything of her. Let me not lose you both. If you have any regard for your own interest, or the peace of him whom you have ever found a father in his care and affection, and whom you will now find so more than you can possibly expect, Dorilaus. Impossible it is to conceive, without being in the very circumstances Horatio was, what strange variety of mingled passions agitated his breast on having read and considered these letters. To find such unhoped condescension from the Baron de Palfoy, and that Dorilaus was still living, and had the same, if not more, tender inclinations for him than ever, the latter of which he had long since ceased to hope, was sufficient to have overwhelmed even the most phlegmatic person with an excess of joy. But then the dark expressions in both these letters put his brain on the rack. The Baron had seemed to refer to an explanation of what he darkly hinted at in the letter of Dorilaus, but that he found rather more obsolete. He could imagine nothing farther than that Dorilaus, having resolved to make him his heir, as he remembered some people said before he left England, on the knowledge of that intelligence the Baron de Palfoy had consented to his marriage with mademoiselle Charlotta, and this, her being permitted to write to him, confirmed. This indeed was the supreme aim of his desires, and this it was that made him quit Saint-Germain, in hope of raising himself to a condition which might enable her to own her affection to him without a blush. But transporting as this idea was, it was mingled with disquiet. To reflect on the terms which both the Baron and Dorilaus seemed to insist on for the accomplishment of his wishes. Though he impatiently longed to see Dorilaus after so long an absence, though in the possession of Charlotta all his hopes were centred, yet to leave a prince who had so highly favoured him, and under whose banners he had gained so much consideration, was a piece of ingratitude which it was worse than death for him to be guilty of. No, said he, it would be to render me unworthy of all the blessings they make me hope, should I purchase them on such conditions. How can they demand them of me? The Baron, Charlotta, and Dorilaus have all of them the highest notions of honour, generosity, and gratitude, and can they approve that in me, which I am certain they would not be guilty of themselves? Sure it is but to try me they seem to exact what they are sensible I cannot yield to, without the breach of everything that can entitle me to esteem or love. Thus did he argue within himself for one moment. The next, other reasons, directly opposite to these, presented themselves. Dorilaus, cried he, demands all my obedience, all my gratitude. Without protection I had been an outcast in the world. Whatever honours, whatever happiness I enjoy, is it not to him I owe them? Can I refuse then to comply with commands which he says are necessary to his peace? Besides, was it not Charlotta that inspired this ardour in me for great actions? Was not the possession of that charming maid the sole end I propose to myself in all I have undertaken? And shall I, by refusing her request, madly run the risk of losing her for ever? Does not she wish, her father persuade, and Dorilaus enjoin me to return? Does not love, friendship, duty call me to partake the joys that each affords? And shall I refuse the tender invitation? No, the world cannot condemn me for following motives such as these, and even the royal Charles himself is too generous not to acquit me of ingratitude or cowardice. It must indeed be confessed he had potent inducements for his return to Paris, to combat against those of continuing in the King of Sweden's service, and both by turns appeared so prevalent that it is uncertain which would have got the better, had not an accident happened, which unhappily determined him in favour of the latter. Colonel Poniatowski, who had attended Stanislaus into Poland, now the disturbances of that kingdom were quieted, on hearing the King of Sweden was on some new expedition, obtained leave of Stanislaus to return to the camp, and implored his majesty's permission to be one of those who should partake the glorious toils he was now re-entering into. To which he replied that he should be glad to have him near his person, but feared he would be wanted in Poland. No, may it please your majesty, resumed Poniatowski, there seems to be no longer any business in that kingdom for a soldier. All seem ready to obey the royal Stanislaus, out of affection to his person, and admiration of those virtues they are now perfectly convinced of. Nor is Augustus in a condition to violate the treaty of resignation. Refuse me not, therefore, I beseech your majesty, continued he, falling upon both his knees, what I look on as my greatest happiness, as it is my greatest glory. The king seemed very well pleased at the emphasis with which he expressed himself, and having raised him from the posture he was in, be it so, cried he, henceforward we will be inseparable. Horatio was charmed with this testimony of love and zeal in a person who had doubtless friends and kindred who would have been glad he had less attachment to a service so full of dangers as that of the King of Sweden, and somewhat ashamed he had ever entertained a thought of quitting it, resolved, as he had been more obliged, not to show less gratitude than Poniatowski. Therefore, without any further deliberation, retired to his quarters, and prepared the following answers to the letters he had been brought. As all things in a lover's heart yields to the darling object, the first he wrote was to his mistress. To Mademoiselle de Palfoy. With what transports I received yours, adorable Charlotta, I am little able to express. To find I am not forgotten, that what I have done is approved by her for whom alone I live, and whose praise alone can make me vain, so swallowed up all other considerations, that it had almost made me quit Alrenstadt that moment, and fly to pour beneath your feet my gratitude and joy. But glory, tyrannic glory, would not suffer me to obey the soft impulse, nor re-enjoy that blessing, till conscious I deserved it better. My friends overrate my services, and though that partial indulgence is the ultimate of my ambition, I would dare not abuse what they are so good to offer. To feast my long famished sight with gazing once more upon your charms, I would forego everything but the hope of rendering myself one day more worthy of it. Too dear I prize the good wishes you vouchsafe to have for me, not to attempt everything in my power to prevent the disappointment of them. The little I have yet done, alas, serves but to prove how much the man, who has in view rendering himself acceptable to the divine Charlotta, dares to do, when dangers worthy of his courage present themselves. A small time may perhaps afford me an opportunity, yet did you know how dear this self-denial costs me, you would confess it the greatest proof of affection ever man gave. Permit me therefore to gratify an ambition which has no other aim than a justification of the favours I receive. Continue to look with a favourable eye on my endeavours, and they cannot then fail of such success as may give me a claim to the glorious title of my most adored and loved Charlotta's everlasting slave, Horatio. To her father he wrote in the following manner. To the Baron de Palfoy, my lord, the favours your goodness confers upon me are such as can be equalled by but one thing in the world, and that is my just and grateful sense of them. Charming would be the toils of war did all employed in them meet a recompense like mine. Is there a man so mean, so poor in spirit, that praises such as I receive might not animate to actions worthy of them? What acknowledgments can I make the count suitable to the immense obligations I owe him, for inspiring your lordship with sentiments which, though the supreme wish of my aspiring soul, I never durst allow myself to hope, and which afford a prospect of future accumulated blessings, such as I could scarce flatter myself with being real, were not the transporting idea in some measure confirmed to me by your having given a sanction to a correspondence I so lately despaired of ever obtaining. Blessed change! Ecstatic condescensions! Fortune has done all she can for me, and anticipated all the good that, after a long train of services and approved fidelity, I scarce should have presumed to hope. O my lord, I have no words to thank you as I ought. It is deeds alone, and rendering myself worthy of your indulgence, that must preserve your good opinion, and keep you from repenting having overwhelmed me with this profusion of happiness. Yet how joyfully could I now pursue the route to Paris, and content myself with owing everything merely to your goodness, were I not withheld by all the considerations that ought to have weight with a man of honour. My royal general is inflexible to the persuasions of almost all the courts in Christendom, and hurried by his thirst of fame or some other more latent motive, has given orders to prepare for a march, where or against whom is yet a secret to the army, but by the preparations for it we believe they are not short journeys we are to take. Should I now quit a service where I have been promoted so much beyond my merit, what, my lord, but cowardice or ingratitude could be imputed to me as the motive? Not all my reasons, powerful as they are, would have any weight with a prince who is deaf to everything but the calls of glory, and I must return loaden with his displeasure and the reproaches of all I leave behind. Now to return is certain infamy, to go is in pursuit of honour. Your lordship will not therefore be surprised I make choice of the latter, since no hazard can be equal to that of forfeiting the little reputation I have acquired, and which alone can render me worthy of any part of the favours I have received. I am, with the extremest respect and submission, your lordship's eternally devoted servant, Horatio. The last and most difficult task he had to go through was the refusal he must give to Dorilaus, who had laid his commands on him in such express terms, and it was not without a good deal of blotting, altering and re-altering, he at length formed an epistle to him in these terms. To my more than father, my only patron, protector and benefactor, the most worthy Dorilaus, my dear and most ever honoured sir, to hear that you are living, and still remember me with kindness, affords too great a transport to suffer me to throw away any thought either on the motives of your long silence, or that happiness which you tell me I may expect has been the produce of it. It is sufficient for me to know I am still blessed in the favour of the most excellent person that ever lived, and am not in the least anxious for an explanation of any further good. To tell you with how much ardency I long to throw myself at your feet, to relate to you all the various accidents that have befallen me, since first you condescended to put me in the path of glory, and to pour out my soul before you with thanksgiving, would be as impossible as it is for me at present to enjoy that blessing. The king's affairs, it is true, would suffer nothing by my absence, but, sir, what would the world say of me if after a whole year of inactivity and idleness I flew, on the first appearance of danger, and forsook a prince by whom I have been so highly favoured? Instead of the character I have always been ambitious of attaining, should I not be branded with everlasting infamy? Put not, therefore, I beseech you, to so severe a test that love and duty to which you cannot have a greater claim than I a readiness to pay. Did you command my life, it is yours. I owe it to you, and with it all that can render it agreeable. But, sir, my honour, my reputation must survive when I am no more. It was the first and will be the last bent of my desires. No perils can come in any degree of competition with those of being deprived of that, nor any indulgencies of fortune compensate for the loss of it. Pardon then this enforced disobedience, and believe it is the only thing in which I could be guilty of it. I very much lament my sister's absence, as I find by yours she went without your permission. Time and reflection will doubtless bring her to a more just sense of what she, as well as myself, ought to have of your goodness to us, and make her return full of sincere contrition for having offended you. I should implore your favourable opinion of her actions in the meantime, were not all the interest I have in you too little to apologize for my own behaviour. All, sir, I dare to implore is pardon for myself, and that you will be assured no son, no dependent whatever, would more rejoice in an opportunity of testifying his duty, affection, gratitude and submission, than him who is now constrained by ties, which I flatter myself you will not hereafter disapprove, to swerve in some measure from them, and whose soul and all the faculties of it are eternally devoted to you. Horatio. These dispatches being sent away, he became more composed, and set his whole mind on his departure, and taking leave of those friends and acquaintance he had contracted at Leipzig and Alrenstadt. The time of the army marching being fixed in a few days, though what route they were to take none, except Count Piper, General Renchild, Count Horn, and some few others of the cabinet council, were made privy to. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 19. The King of Sweden leaves Saxony, marches into Lithuania, meets with an instance of Russian brutality, drives the Tsar out of Grodno, and pursues him to the Borysthenes. Horatio with others is taken prisoner by the Russians, and carried to Petersburg, where they suffer the extremest miseries. The word at length being given, the tents were struck, the trumpets sounded, and the whole army was immediately in motion. Never was a more gay and glorious sight. The splendour of their arms and the richness of their habits blazed against the sun. But what was yet more pleasing and spread greater terror among their enemies was the cheerfulness that sat on every face, and shewed they followed with the utmost alacrity their beloved and victorious monarch. It was in the latter end of September, a season extremely cold in those parts, that they began their march, but hardships were natural to the King of Sweden's troops, and as they perceived they were going into Lithuania, a place where their valour had been so well proved against the invading Muscovites, their cheeks glowed with a fresher red on the remembrance of their former victories. They passed near Dresden, the capital of the electorate of Saxony, and made Augustus tremble in his palace, though the word of the king, which ever was inviolable, had been given that he should enjoy those dominions in peace. During the course of this, the Czar had fallen upon the frontiers of Poland above 20 times, not like a general desiring to come to a decisive battle, but like a robber, plundering, ravaging, and destroying the defenceless country people, and immediately flying on the approach of any troops, either of Charles XII or King Stanislaus. The Swedes in their march met several parties sent on these expeditions, but who retired on sight of the army into woods, and were most of them either killed or taken prisoners by detachments sent in to pursue them by the king of Sweden. In their march towards Grodno they found the remains of an encampment, several pieces of cannon, and ammunition of all sorts, but not one creature to guard it, the troops to whom it belonged having all dispersed and hid themselves. On examining the tents, they were surprised with the sight of a very beautiful woman, who was lying on the ground in one of them, with 3 others who seemed endeavouring to comfort her, and by the respect they paid her, that they were her dependents, but had all of them their garments torn and bloody, their hair hanging in strange disorder about their ears, their flesh discoloured with bruises and other marks of violence, and as well as their disconsolate superior, were spectacles of the utmost distress. The king of Sweden himself, followed by General Horn, Poniatowski, Horatio, and several others, who hardly ever lost sight of him, came into this tent, and being touched with so moving a scene, demanded the occasion, on which the prostrate lady being told who it was that spoke, suddenly started up, and throwing herself at his feet, O king, cried she in the German language, as famous for justice as for being invincible in war, revenge the cause of helpless innocence and virtue. O let the murderous brutal Russians find heaven's vindictive arm in you, its great vicegerent. She was able to utter no more. The inward agonies she sustained, on being about to relate the story of her wrongs, became too violent for speech, and she sunk motionless to the earth. 2 of the women, assisted by some Swedes, carried her out of the tent, as thinking the open air most proper to revive her, and she who remained satisfied the king's curiosity in these words. May it please your majesty, said she, my mistress, that afflicted lady who just now implored your royal pity, is of the noble family of the Castleberg in Saxony, only daughter to the present count. Her person, before these heavy misfortunes fell upon her, was deservedly reputed one of the most beautiful that graced the court of Dresden. Her birth, her youth, her charms, and the great fortune it was expected she would be mistress of, attracted a great number of persons who addressed her for marriage. Her own inclinations, as well as the count her father's commands, disposed of her to Emamuski, a Polish nobleman, and she had been scarce 1 month a bride before they unhappily took this journey to visit my lord's mother, who lives at Travenstadt. In our way we met a party of straggling Muscovites, who, notwithstanding the strict league between our elector and the Czar, and the knowledge they had by our passports that we were Saxons, stripped us of everything, killed all our men servants, and having given my lord several wounds, left him for dead upon the place, then dragged us miserable women to the camp. My lady in the midst of faintings, and when she was incapable even of flying to death for refuge, was brutally ravished, and we, her wretched attendants, suffered the same abuse. Shame will not let me, continued she, blushing and weeping, acquaint your majesty with the shocking and repeated violations we were compelled to bear. The wretches casting lots who first should gratify his monstrous desires. We were all bound to trees, and without any means of opposition, but our shrieks and cries to unrelenting heaven. My lord, having a little recovered himself, had crawled, as well as his wounds would give him leave, after us, and arrived even while the horrid scene was acting. Rage giving him new strength and spirits, he snatched a sword that lay upon the earth, and sent to perdition the villain who was about to add to the dishonour which had been, alas, but too much completed by the others. The death of their companion incensing the accursed Muscovites, they turned upon him, and in a moment laid him dead just at the feet of his ruined and almost expiring wife. And having satiated their wicked will, they left us, bound as we were, where we continued the remainder of the day and whole night, and had doubtless perished through hunger and extreme cold, if a second party had not passed that way, who having been out on a marauding were then returning to the camp. Being actuated by somewhat more compassion than the former, one of the officers made us be untied, and having heard our story, blamed the cruelty with which we had been treated, and brought us to his tent, the same we are now in, and ordered something should be given for our refreshment. but my lady has continued obstinate to die, and to that end has refused all sustenance. This, invincible monarch, is the sad history of our misfortunes, misfortunes which, alas, can never be retrieved, nor admit any consolation, but in the hope of vengeance. Here a torrent of tears closed the sad narration, and the king cried out, turning as he spoke to us that followed him, It is the cause of heaven and earth, my friends, said he, to punish these barbarians, and show them that there is a God, for sure at present they are ignorant of it. The generous monarch after this gave orders that these afflicted and abused women should be escorted to a place of safety, and for that purpose halted for the space of 2 days, then proceeded towards Grodno with such expedition that after ages will look upon it as incredible that so large an army, and also encumbered with a great quantity of baggage, could have marched in the time they did. But the king of Sweden was on fire to encounter in person the Czar of Muscovy, who with about 2000 men was then in that city. So great was his impatience that he galloped before his troops, not above 600 of those best mounted being able to keep pace with him, till he came in sight of the south gate, which gave him entrance without any opposition, while the Czar and his forces made their escape out at the north gate, not doubting but the king of Sweden's whole army were come up with him. He was afterwards so much vexed and ashamed to think he had quitted the town to no more than 600 of the enemy, that to retrieve a mistake which he feared might be looked upon as cowardice, being informed the body of the army was near 5 leagues off, he sent a party of 1500 horse in order to surprise the king and his few guards. The Muscovites entered by night, but the alarm being given, the fortune which still had waited on the Swedish armies immediately put them all to rout, and the army soon after arriving, the conqueror lost no time, but pursued those that remained alive into the forest of Mensky, on the other side of which the Czar had then entrenched himself, and had made the general rendezvous of the Russian army, which was continually divided into parties, and sometimes falling on the Swedes in the rear, and sometimes in the flank, very much annoyed them in their march. These brave men had also other difficulties to encounter with. The forest was so extremely thick, that the infantry were obliged to fell down trees every moment during the whole time of their passage, to make way for the baggage and troops. Their industry and vigour surmounting all these obstacles, they once more found themselves in an open country, but on the banks of a river, on the opposite side of which were 20,000 Muscovites placed to oppose their crossing. The king made no delay, but quitting his horse threw himself into the river, and was instantly followed by all the foot, while the troops under the command of General Renchild and Horn galloped round through the morass in which the river ended, and both together charged the enemy, who after some faint show of resistance fled with the utmost precipitation. The whole army being now joined, marched on towards the Borysthenes, but with fatigues which are impossible to be described. Horatio kept still close to the king, and whether he fought or marched, was on foot or on horseback, was always in his sight, ready to bear his commands to the generals, or assist him in the time of danger. More than once had the conqueror been indebted to this young warrior for turning the point of the destructive sword from giving him the same death he was dealing about to others. Yet in all the dangers he had been in, never had he received one wound, and this often made the king say, who was a firm believer in predestination, that heaven designed him for a soldier. His fortune, his valour, his activity, added to his obliging and modest behaviour, indeed rendered him so dear to his royal master, that there were very few, if any, to whom he gave greater marks of his favour. And had Dorilaus, or even Charlotta herself, all tender as she was, and trembling for the hazards she knew he had been exposed to, seen him thus caressed and honoured by the most glorious prince and greatest hero in the world, they could scarce have wished him to quit the post he was in, much less persuaded him to do it. He hitherto, indeed, had experienced only the happiness of a martial life. For the fatigues, hardships and dangers of it he had as little regard as the intrepid and indefatigable prince he served. But now arrived the time which was to inflict on him the worst miseries of it, and make him almost curse a vocation he had been in his soul so much attached to. The King of Sweden, with his usual success, having passed the Borysthenes, encountered a party of 10,000 Muscovites and 6,000 Kalmuk Tartars, but they gave way on the first onset and fled into a wood, where the king, following the dictates of his great courage more than prudence, pursuing them, fell into an ambuscade, which, throwing themselves between him and 3 regiments of horse that were with him, hemmed him in, and now began a very unequal fight. Many of the gallant Swedes were cut to pieces, and the Muscovites made quite up to his majesty. 2 aides-de-camps were killed within his presence. His own horse was shot under him, and as an equerry was presenting him with another, both horse and man were struck dead in the same moment. Horatio immediately alighted in order to mount the king, who now on foot behaved with incredible valour, and in that action was surrounded and taken prisoner, as were several others that had fought near his person. He had the satisfaction, however, while they were disarming and tying his hands, to see Colonel Dardoff with his regiment force through the Kalmuks, and arrive timely enough to disengage the king, after which the army recovering its rank and pouring in upon the enemy, he was not without hopes of regaining his liberty. But he was sat upon a horse, and bound fast to the saddle, and compelled, with the others that were taken with him, to accompany the Muscovites in their flight, so was ignorant in what manner this re-encounter ended. Soon after repairing to the Tsar's quarters, these unfortunate officers of the King of Sweden were, with some others who had before become their prize, sent under a strong guard to Petersburg, and thrown altogether into a miserable dungeon. It would be impossible to describe the horrors of this place. Light there was, but it was only so much as just served to show to each of these unhappy sufferers the common calamity of them all. The roof was arched indeed, but so low that the shortest among them could scarce stand upright. No kind of furniture, not even straw to cover the damp earthen floor, which served them for a seat by day and bed at night. Inured as they had been to hardships, the noisomeness of this dreadful vault killed many of them, and among the rest a young Swedish officer named Gullenstern, one with whom Horatio had contracted a very intimate friendship, and who, for his many excellent qualities, had been so dear to the king, that seeing him one day greatly wounded, and in danger of being taken prisoner, that generous prince obliged him to mount on his own horse, and fought on foot himself, till another could be brought. The sight of this gentleman expiring in his arms filled Horatio with so poignant an anguish, that he wanted but little of following him, and indeed, had it not been for the sanguine hopes that the king would in a short time complete the ruin of the Tsar, and not only restore them liberty, but also add vengeance to it, for the ill treatment they had found in his dominions, few, if any of them, had been able to support the miseries inflicted on them by these inhuman wretches, who, not content with burying them in a manner alive, for the dungeon they were in was deep under ground, and allowing them no other food than bread and water once in 24 hours, made savage sport at their condition, ridiculed the conquests of their king, and spoke in the most opprobrious terms of his royal person, which, when some of them were unable to restrain themselves from answering in a manner befitting their duty and love of justice, they were silenced by the most cruel stripes. Thus were the officers of the King of Sweden, the meanest of whom were fit to be generals in any other army, subjected to the servile taunts and insolent behaviour of wretches undeserving to be ranked among the human species. A very little time had doubtless made them all find graves among these barbarians. Scarce a day passed over without their company decreasing by 2 or 3, who were no sooner dead than dragged out by the heels and thrown like dogs into a pit, without the least funeral rites. But Providence at length thought fit to send them a relief by means they least expected. In one of the incursions made by the Muscovites into Poland, a very beautiful lady, whose father had been killed in asserting the cause of Stanislaus, was made prisoner. Prince Menzikoff, who commanded these battalions, saw her, and became enamoured of her charms. She was destitute of all friends, and in the conqueror's power, so thought it best to yield what otherwise she found him determined to seize. In fine, she was his mistress, and her ready compliance with his desires, together with the love she either had or feigned to have for him, afterwards gained her an absolute ascendant over him. Every one knows the interest he had with the Czar, and he so far exerted it as to get this fair favourite lodged in the palace, where she was served with the same state and respect as if she had been his wife. This lady, whose name was Edella, happened to be walking with some of her attendants near where these unfortunate gentlemen were buried, at a time when 3 of them were dragged to their wretched sepulchre, and was touched with compassion to see anything that had a human shape thus coarsely treated, though after death, and had the curiosity to order one of her people to inquire who those persons were, and what they had done, which hindered them from being allowed a Christian burial. She was no sooner informed that they were Swedish prisoners, than her soul shuddered at the thoughts of the Russian barbarity, and not doubting but their usage during life had been of a piece with that after death, she resolved, if possible, to procure some abatement of the miseries of those who yet survived. To this end she made it her business to examine what number of prisoners had been brought, of what condition they were, and where lodged, and being well acquainted with all she wanted to know, went to the governor of Petersburg, and so well represented how dishonourable it was to the Czar, and how opposite to the law of nations, to treat prisoners of war in a worse manner than they would do condemned felons, that he, knowing the power of Prince Menzikoff, and fearing to disoblige one so dear to him by a refusal, consented they should be removed into an upper part of the prison, where they would have more air, and also that they should have an allowance of meat every day. As the governor was a true Muscovite in his nature, and had an implacable hatred to the king of Sweden and all that belonged to him, this was gaining a great deal, but it was not enough to satisfy the charitable disposition of Edella. After their removal, she went in person to visit those of them whom she heard were gentlemen, and finding them covered only with rags, which some of the soldiers had put on them, after having stripped them of their own rich habits, she ordered others lined with furs to be made for them, to defend them from the coldness of the season, and not content to retrench a great part of her own table, sold several fine jewels and other trinkets the prince had bestowed on her, to supply them with wine, and whatever necessaries she supposed them to be accustomed to. That she might be certain those entrusted by her did not abuse her good intentions, she went often to the prison herself, to see how they were served, and would sometimes enter into discourse with them concerning the battles they had been in, the settlement of Stanislaus, and many other things relating to Polish affairs. The gallant and courtly manner in which Horatio expressed himself on every occasion made her take a particular pleasure in hearing him speak. That rough, blunt behaviour to which she had been accustomed since her being brought a captive into Muscovy gave double charms to the politeness with which she found herself entertained by our young warrior. His blooming years and the gracefulness of his person contributed not a little also towards rendering everything he said more agreeable. Her liking of him grew by degrees into a friendship, no less tender than one feels for very near relations, and who have never done anything to disoblige us, are more endeared by being under undeserved calamity. But as the inclination she had for him was perfectly innocent, and no ways prejudicial to the prince who was in possession of her person, she made no secret of it, either to himself or those she conversed with, and was always talking of the wit, delicacy and handsomeness of one of the prisoners, whom it was well known were pensioners to her bounty. But how dangerous is it to be too open before persons who, void of all true generosity, or the lead principle of honour themselves, never failed to put the worst construction on the actions of others. Edella was very near being undone by her sincerity in acknowledging the distinction she paid to merit, or the compassion she felt for misfortunes, in a country where humanity to enemies is looked upon as a crime, friendship to those of the same party altogether unknown, and even common civility never practised but for the gratification of self-interest or some favourite passion. This beautiful Polander, however, being treated by the Muscovites, on account of the influence she had over Prince Menzikoff, with as much complaisance as it was in their power to show, imagined their disposition less savage than it was in reality, and when she testified the pity she had for these unhappy gentlemen, it was with design to excite it in others, and engage them to join with her in petitioning the Czar at his return for their enlargement, there being no cartel or exchange of prisoners subsisting between him and the King of Sweden. Among the number she hoped to gain to her party was Mattakesa, the relic of a general who had been in great favour with his prince. This lady, who could speak French, having learned it of a recusant that took shelter in Russia, consented to go with her one day to the prison, and no sooner saw Horatio than, unfortunately for him, Edella and herself, she became charmed with him. As she was of the number of those who think nothing a crime that suits their own inclination, she took not the least pains to subdue the growing passion, but rather indulged it, in order to receive the highest degree of pleasure in the gratification. She doubted not but Edella was her rival, and that it was for his sake alone she had been so beneficent to his fellow sufferers. To supplant her, therefore, was the first step she had to take, and she resolved to omit nothing for that purpose. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 20. The treachery of a Russian lady to her friend, her passion for Horatio, the method he took to avoid making any return, and some other entertaining occurrences. It is easy to believe that Horatio, though relieved from the extremity of misery he suffered while in the dungeon, was far from being able to content himself with his present condition. 1,000 times he reproached himself for pursuing the dictates of a glory which now seemed so tyrannic. Have I, cried he, hazarded the eternal displeasure of the best of men, refused the invitation of the adorable Charlotta, slighted the condescensions of her father, been deaf both to interest and love, to become a prisoner to the worst of barbarians? Who now will pity me? Or if they yet would be so good, how shall I acquaint them with my wretched fate? Nay, were there even a possibility of that, what would the compassion of the whole world avail, since a slave to those who, contrary to the law of nations and even common humanity, refuse, on any terms, to release the wretches fallen into their savage power? In this manner did he bewail himself night and day, and indeed had but too just reasons for doing so. He had heard that the last time the Czar had been at Petersburg, he had sent all the prisoners he had taken to Siberia and other provinces of the great Tartary, where they were compelled without any distinction to do the work of horses rather than men, and doubted not but his next return all those now in his power would meet the same fate, though the generous King of Sweden had sent back the Muscovites he had taken by 1,500 and 2,000 at a time. This, however, may be said in favour of the Czar, that by the many attempts he made to civilize his barbarous subjects, it must be supposed he would have been glad to have imitated this generosity, had it been confident with his safety. But the case had this difference: Charles XII feared not the number of the Muscovites, but the Czar feared the courage of the Swedes. What also increased the affliction of these gentlemen was that, being debarred from all intelligence, they could hear nothing of their king, whom each of them loved with a kind of filial affection and duty. Horatio and 2 others had been witnesses of the extreme danger in which they left him, and though at the time they were seized he had killed 13 or 14 Muscovites with his own hand, and they perceived General Dardoff had come up to his relief, yet they could not be certain of his safety till at length the sweet conditioned Edella, perceiving the despair they were in on this account, informed them that his majesty was not only well, but as successful as ever, that he had passed far into Ukrainia, had defeated the Muscovites in 5 battles, and so far reduced the Czar that he had condescended to make some overtures of peace, which having been rejected, it was the common opinion that in a very short time the Swedes would enter Moscow and become arbiters of Russia as they had been of Poland. Adequate to their late grief was their satisfaction at this joyful news. Horatio was transported above his companions, and threw himself at the feet of the fair intelligencer. But she desired they would all of them moderate their contentment so far as to hinder the guards, who had the care of them, from perceiving it, because, said she, it might not only draw on yourself worse treatment, but also render me suspected of being against the interest of the court, on which my fate has reduced me to become dependent. Horatio, as well as the others, assured her he would take care to manage the felicity she had bestowed upon them, so as not to be in any way prejudicial to her, and she took her leave, promising to be with them again in a few days, and bring them further information. A courier from the camp, she said, being expected every hour. But while this compassionate lady was pleasing herself by giving all the ease in her power to the distressed, the cruel Mattakesa was plotting her destruction. She had several of her kindred, and a great many acquaintance in the army, who were in considerable posts, to all of whom she exclaimed against the loose behaviour, as she termed it, of Edella, and represented her charities to the prisoners as the effects of a wanton inclination. This she doubted not, but would come to Prince Menzikoff's ears, and perhaps incense him enough to cause her to be privately made away with. For as she imagined nothing less than the most amorous intercourse between her and Horatio, she thought it unadvisable to declare the passion she had for him, till a rival so formidable, by the advantages she had over her in youth and beauty, should be removed. This base woman, therefore, impatiently waited the arrival of the next courier, to find how far her stratagem had succeeded, and the moment she heard he had delivered the dispatches, flew to the apartment of Edella in hopes of being informed of what she so much desired to know. She was not altogether deceived in her expectations. She found that lady drowned in tears, with a letter lying open before her, and on her inquiring with a show of the utmost concern the motives of her grief, the other, who looked on her as her real friend, replied, Alas, Mattakesa, I have cruel enemies. I cannot guess for what cause, for willingly I never gave offence to any one. But see, continued she, how barbarously they have abused my innocence, and represented actions which, heaven knows, were influenced only by charity and compassion, as the worst of crimes. With these words she gave her the letter which she had just received from the prince. Mattakesa took it with greedy pleasure, and found it contained these words. To Edella, Madam, I left you in a place furnished, as I thought, with everything necessary for your satisfaction. But I find I was mistaken in your constitution, and that there was something wanting, which rather than not possess, you must have recourse to a prison to procure. Ungrateful as you are to the affection I have treated you with, I am sorry for your ill conduct, and could wish you had been at least more private in your amours. Few men but would have sent an order for removing you, and the persons for whose sake you have made these false steps, into a place where you would have cause to curse the fatal inclination that seduced you. Think therefore how much you owe a prince, who, instead of punishing your faults, contents himself with letting you know he is not ignorant of them. If you make the right use of the lenity I show on this occasion, you may perhaps retrieve some part of the influence you once had over me, but see the Swedish prisoners no more, if you hope or desire ever to see me. Menzikoff. Mattakesa affected the greatest astonishment on having read the letter, and after having cursed the persons that put such vile suspicions into the prince's head, asked her what she intended to do. What can I do, answered the sorrowful Edella, but write to my lord all the assurances that words can give him, which heaven knows I can truly do, that I never wronged him, even in wish or thought, and that since there are people so cruel to misinterpret to my dishonour what was nothing more than mere charity, to obey his commands with the utmost punctuality, and never set my foot into that prison more. Her false friend could not but applaud her resolution, yet told her it was pity that ill tongues should deprive those unfortunate gentlemen of the relief she had hitherto afforded them, or herself of the pleasure she took in their conversation. As for the first, said Edella, heaven may perhaps raise them other friends more capable of lifting them, and as to the other, were it infinitely greater, it would be my inclination, as it is my duty, to sacrifice everything to the will of a prince whom I love, and to whom I am so much obliged. Mattakesa having thus compared her design, so far as to be under no apprehensions of being interrupted by her imagined rival, though she had rather she had been poisoned or strangled, went directly to the prison and told the gentleman it was with the utmost concern she must acquaint them that Edella would never visit them any more, nor continue the weekly pension she had hitherto allowed them. Those among them who understood her, and the others to whom Horatio interpreted what she said, looked upon one another with a great deal of consternation, as imagining one of them had done something to offend her, and thereby the rest were thought unworthy of her favours. Every one endeavoured to clear himself of what he easily saw his companions suspected him guilty of, till Mattakesa, with a scornful smile, told them that it was not owing to the behaviour of any of them, but to Edella's own inconstant disposition, that they owed the withdrawing of her bounty; but to console them for the loss of it, she promised to speak to some of her friends in their behalf, and also to contribute something herself towards alleviating their misfortunes. But, added she, I am not the mistress of a prince and first favourite, so have it not in my power to act as the generosity of my nature inclines me to do. She stayed with them a considerable time, and entertained them with little else than railing on Edella, and to make her appear as odious and contemptible as she could do to Horatio, insinuated that it was for the sake of a young needy favourite she had been obliged to withdraw the allowance they had from her. On taking leave, she found means to slip a little billet into Horatio's hands, unperceived by any of the company, which as soon as he had a convenient opportunity he opened, and found these words in French: To the agreeable Horatio, sir, though I have not perhaps so much beauty as Edella, I have twice her sincerity, and not many years older. Such as I am, however, I fancy you will think a correspondence with me of too much advantage to be refused. If you will counterfeit an indisposition to-morrow, I will out of excessive charity visit you, and bring you a refreshment I flatter myself will not be disagreeable to a man in your circumstances. Farewell, be secret, and love as well as you can. Yours, Mattakesa. Of all the accidents that had befallen Horatio since his leaving England, none ever so much surprised him as the prodigious impudence of this lady. He had heard talk of such adventures, but never till now believed there could be any such thing in nature as a woman that offered herself in this manner, without the least solicitation from the person on whom she wished to lavish what ought only to be the reward of an approved, or at least a show of the most violent passion. The dilemma he was now in to behave was also equal to his astonishment. Had she been the most lovely of her sex, as she was very much the reverse, the ever-present idea of his dear Charlotta would have defended his heart from the invasion of any other charms; but he needed not that pre-engagement to make him look with detestation on a woman of Mattakesa's principles. When he reflected on what she had said concerning Edella, he found her base, censorious, and unjust; and when he considered the manner in which she proceeded in regard to himself, he saw a lewdness and audacity which rendered her doubly odious to him. He doubted not but she was wicked and subtle enough to contrive some means of revenging herself, in case she met with a disappointment in her wishes, yet had too great an abhorrence to be able to entertain one thought of gratifying them. As he was young and unexperienced in the world, he would have been glad of some advice how to act so as not to incur her resentment, yet avoid her love. But the strict notions he had of honour remonstrated to him that he ought not to betray a secret of that nature, though confided in him by an ill woman. Her baseness, cried he to himself, would be no excuse for mine, and it is better for me to risk whatever her malice may inflict, than forfeit my character by exposing a woman who pretends to love me. These thoughts kept him waking the whole night, and his restlessness being observed by an old Swedish officer who lay with him, he was very much importuned by him to discover to him the occasion. Horatio defended himself for a good while by the considerations before recited, but at length reflecting that the person who was so desirous of being let into the secret had a great deal of discretion, he at length suffered himself to be prevailed upon, and told him what Mattakesa had wrote to him, for he did not understand a word of French, so could not read the letter. This officer no sooner heard the story than he laughed heartily at the scruples of Horatio in thinking himself bound to conceal an affair of this nature with a woman of the character Mattakesa must needs be. He also rallied his delicacy, as he termed it, in hesitating one moment whether he should gratify the lady's inclinations. One would imagine, said he, that so long a fall from love as we have had should render our appetites more keen. What though Mattakesa be neither handsome nor very young, she is a woman, and amorous, and methinks there should need no other excitements to a young man like you. Horatio, though naturally gay, was not at present in a disposition to continue this raillery, and told his friend he looked on this inclination of Mattakesa to be as great a misfortune as could happen to them. For, said he, as it is wholly out of my power to make her any returns, that violence of temper which has transported her to forget the modesty of her sex will probably, when she finds herself rejected, make her as easily throw off all the softness of it, and you may all feel the effects of that revenge she will endeavour to take on me. The other was entirely of his opinion, and they both agreed that some way ought to be thought on to avert the storm her resentment might in all probability occasion. After many fruitless inventions, they at last hit upon one which had a prospect of success. They had in their company a gentleman called Mullern, nephew to Chancellor Mullern, who had attended the king in all his wars. He was handsome, well made, and his age, though much superior to that of Horatio, yet was not so far advanced as to render him disagreeable to the fair sex. He was of a more than ordinary sanguine disposition, and had often said, of all the hardships their captivity had inflicted on them, he felt none so severely as being deprived of a free conversation with women. In the ravages the king of Sweden's arms had made to Lithuania, Saxony, and Poland, he was sure to secure to himself 3 or 4 of the finest women, and though he had been often checked by his uncle, and even by the king himself, for giving too great a loose to his amorous inclinations, yet all their admonitions were too weak to restrain the impetuosity of his desires this way. To him, therefore, they resolved to communicate the affair, and as he was in other respects the most proper object among them to succeed in supplanting Horatio, so he was also by being perfectly well versed in the French language, which the rest were ignorant of. Accordingly they told him what had happened, shewed him the letter, and how willing Horatio would be to transfer all the interest he had in this lady to him, if he could by any means ingratiate himself into her favour. Mullern was transported at the idea, and the stratagem contrived among them for this purpose was executed in the following manner. Mattakesa was punctual to her promise she had made in her letter, and when she came into the room, where she usually found the gentlemen all together, it being that where they dined, and saw not Horatio, she doubted not but he had observed her directions and pretended himself indisposed, so asked for him expecting to be told that he was ill. But when they answered that he was gone with one of the keepers to the top of the round tower, in order to satisfy his curiosity in taking a view of the town, she was confounded beyond expression, and could not imagine what had occasioned him to slight an assignation she had flattered herself he would receive with ecstasy. As she was in a little reverie, endeavouring to comprehend, if possible, the motive of so manifest a neglect, Mullern drew near to her, and beginning to speak of the beauties of that fine city, which the Czar had erected in the midst of war, he told her, that having a little skill in drawing, he had ventured to make a little sketch of it in chalk on the walls of the room where he lay, and entreated her, in the most gallant manner, to look upon it, and give him her opinion how far he had done justice to an edifice so much admired. It cannot be supposed that Mattakesa had in her soul any curiosity to see a work of this nature, yet, to hide as much as she could the disorder she was in at her disappointment, gave him her hand, in order to be conducted to that place where he pretended to have been exercising his genius. As soon as they were entered, he threw the door, as if by incident, which, having a spring lock, immediately was made fast. She either did not, or seemed not to regard what he had done, but casting her eyes round the room, and seeing nothing of what he had mentioned, Where is this drawing? cried she. In my heart, adorable Mattakesa, answered he, falling at her feet at the same time. It is not the city of Petersburg, but the charming image of its brightest ornament that the god of love has engraven on my heart in characters too indelible ever to be erased. From the first moment I beheld those eyes, my soul has been on fire, and I must have consumed with inward burnings had I not revealed my flame. Pardon, continued he, the boldness of a passion which knows no bounds, and though I may not be so worthy of your love as the too happy Horatio, I am certainly not less deserving of your pity. Surprise, and perhaps a mixture of secret satisfaction, prevented her from interrupting him during the first part of his discourse, but rage, at the mention of Horatio, forced from her this exclamation. Has the villain then betrayed me? cried she. No, madam, replied he, justice obliges me to acquit him, though my rival. He had the misfortune, in putting your billet into his pocket, to let it fall. I took it up unseen by him, opened it, read it, and must confess that all my generosity to my friend was wholly swallowed up in my passion for you. I returned not to him that kind declaration you were pleased to make him, and he is ignorant of the blessing you intended for him. If the crime I have been guilty of seems unpardonable in your eyes, command my death. I will instantly obey you, for life would be a torment under your displeasure, and if in my last moments you vouchsafe some part of that softness to the occasion of my fate that you so lavishly bestowed on the fortunate Horatio, I will bless the lovely mouth that dooms me to destruction. He pronounced all this with an emphasis which made her not doubt the power of her charms, and surveying him while he was speaking, found enough in his person to compensate for the disappointment she had met with from Horatio. Besides, she reflected, that if what he had told her concerning the dropping the letter was a fiction, it was however an ingenious one, and shewed his wit as well as love in bringing both himself and friend off in so handsome a manner. She was infatuated with the praises he gave her. The pathetic expressions he made use of assured her of the ardency of his desires, and as she could not be certain of being able to inspire Horatio with the same, she wisely chose to accept the present offer, rather than wait for what might perhaps at last deceive her expectations. She made, however, no immediate answer, but her eyes told him she was far from being displeased with what he had said, and gave him courage to take up one of her hands and kiss it, with an eagerness which confirmed his protestations. At last, Well, Mullern, said she, looking languishingly on him, since chance has made you acquainted with my foible, I think I must bribe you to secrecy by forgiving the liberties you take with me, and if I were convinced you really love me as well as you pretend, might indulge you yet further. An unaccountable caprice indeed swayed me in favour of Horatio, but I am now half inclinable to believe you are more deserving my regard. But rise, continued she, I will hear nothing from you while in that posture. Mullern, who was no less bold in love than war, immediately obeyed her, and testified his gratitude for her condescension by giving a sudden spring, and snatching her to his breast, pressed her in so arduous a manner that she would have been incapable of resisting, even though she had an inclination to do so. But she, no less transported than himself, returned endearment for endearment, and not only permitted, but assisted all his raptures, absolutely forgot Horatio, as well as all sense of her own shame, and yielded him a full enjoyment, without even an affectation of repugnance. Both parties, in fine, were perfectly satisfied with each other, and having mutually sworn 1,000 oaths of fidelity, which neither of them, it is probable, had any intention to keep, Mullern took upon himself the care of continuing to entertain her in private as often as she came to the prison, and in return she made him a present of a purse of gold, after which they passed into the outer room to prevent censures on their staying too long together. On their return they found Horatio with the other gentlemen. Abandoned as Mattakesa was, she could not keep herself from blushing a little at sight of him, but soon recovering herself by the help of her natural audacity, well, Horatio, said she, what do you think of the little French epigram I put into your hands yesterday? Has it not a very agreeable point? Horatio had such an aversion to all kind of deceit, that even here, where it was so necessary, he could not, without some hesitation, answer to what she said in these words. Some accident or other, cried he, deprived me of the pleasure you were so good as to intend me, for when I put my hand in my pocket, thinking to read it, I perceived I was so unhappy as to have lost it. I looked for it in vain, it was irrecoverably gone, and I am an utter stranger to the contents. And ever shall be so, replied she tartly, only to punish your carelessness of a lady's favour. Know that it was a piece of wit, which would have been highly agreeable to you, but don't expect I shall take the pains to write it over again, or even to tell you the subject on which it turned. Horatio coolly said he could not but confess he had been to blame, and must therefore allow the justice of her proceeding. As none present beside himself, his bedfellow and Mullern, knew the truth of the affair, what passed between them was taken by the others as literally spoken, and little suspected to couch the mystery it really did. Mullern, after this, by the assistance of Horatio and the old officer, had frequent opportunities of gratifying his own and the amorous Mattakesa's desires. The testimonies she gave him, how well she was pleased with his conversation, were for the common good of his companions. Horatio was easy in finding himself out of all danger of any solicitations he was determined never to acquiesce in, and those three who were in the secret passed their time pleasantly enough, whenever they had an opportunity of talking on this adventure, without any of the others being witnesses of what they said. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 21. The prisoner's expectations raised. A terrible disappointment. Some of the chief carried to Prince Mensikoff's palace. Their usage there. Horatio set at liberty, and the occasion. Our captives had soon after a new matter of rejoicing. A Polander in the service of Muscovy, who had been taken prisoner by the Swedes, and was discharged and sent home with a great number of others by the unparalleled generosity of Charles XII, was one of the guards who now did duty in the prison. It was often his turn to bring them their poor allowance of provision, and having some pity for their condition, as well as gratitude for a people who had used him and his companions in a different manner, told them that they might be of good heart. For, said he, you will soon be set at liberty. Our emperor has enough to do to keep his ground in Ukrainia. Charles is as victorious as ever, the prince of the Cossacks, one of the bravest men on earth, next to himself, has entered into an alliance with him. King Stanislaus is sending him succours from Poland, a powerful reinforcement is coming to him from Lithuania, and when these armies are joined, as I believe they already are, nothing can withstand them. You will hear the Swedish march beat from this prison walls, and perhaps see your present conquerors change places with you. And to confirm the truth of what I say, continued he, I can further assure you that the Tsar, before I left the camp, was in the utmost confusion. His council, as well as army, were at a stand, and he had twice made overtures of peace and been refused. This was an intelligence which might well be transporting to the King of Sweden's officers. The thought of seeing him enter Petersburg a conqueror, of once more embracing their old friends and companions, and of triumphing over those who had so cruelly abused the power the chance of war had put into their hands, made them all in their turns hug and bless the kind informer. They also asked him several questions concerning the generals, and each being more particular concerning those they had the greatest interest in, received from this honest soldier all the satisfaction they could desire. As couriers were continually arriving from the army, there passed few days without hearing some farther confirmation of their most sanguine expectations. But at length, the guard being again changed, they lost all further intelligence, and were for several months without being able to hear anything of what passed. They doubted not, however, but as things were in so good a disposition, every day brought them nearer to the completion of their wishes. And it was this pleasing prospect which addressed their misfortunes, and enabled them to sustain cheerfully those hardships which, almost ever since the withdrawing of Idella's bounty, they had laboured under. Mattakesa, in the beginning of her amours with Mullern, had indeed made him some presents, which he shared with his companions, but either the natural inconstancy of her temper making her grow weary of this intrigue for the sake of another, or her circumstances not allowing her to continue such donations, she soon grew sparing of them, and at length totally desisted her visits at the prison. As ever since the compassionate Edella had procured them to be removed from the dungeon, they had enjoyed the privilege of walking on the leads, and going up to the round tower, which being of a very great height, not only overlooked the town, but the country round for a considerable distance, they frequently made use of this indulgence, at first for no other purpose than to have the benefit of the open air, but now in hope of seeing their beloved prince at the head of a victorious army, approaching to give them liberty and relief. But alas, how terrible a reverse of their high-raised expectations had inconstant fortune in store for them. One day, as they were sitting together discoursing on the usual topics with which they entertained each other, and endeavoured to beguile the tedious time, they heard a confused noise, as of some sudden tumult. Though they had now been above a year in Russia, none of them could speak the language well enough to be understood, so could receive no information from the guard, even should they have proved good-natured enough to be willing to satisfy their curiosity. So they all run hastily up to the round tower, whence they easily perceived the town in great confusion, and the people running in such crowds, that in the hurry many were trampled to death in endeavouring to pass the gates. At a distance they perceived standards waving in the air, but could not yet distinguish what arms they bore. A certain shivering and palpitation, the natural consequences of suspense, ran through all their nerves, divided as they were by this sight between hope and fear. But when it drew more near, when, instead of Swedish colours, they beheld those of Russia, when, in the place where they expected to see their gallant king coming to restore them once more to freedom, they saw the implacable Czar enter in triumph, followed by those heroes, the least of whom had lately made him tremble, now in chains, and exposed to the ribald mirth and derision of the gaping crowd, they lost at once their fortitude, and even all sense of expressing their grief at this misfortune. The shock of it was so violent, it even took away the power of feeling it, and they remained for some moments rather like statues carved out by mortal art, than real men created by God, and animated with living souls. A general groan was the first mark they gave of any sensibility of this dreadful stroke of fate. But when recruited spirits once more gave utterance to words, how terrible were their exclamations! Some of them, in the extravagance of despair, said things relating to fate and destiny, which on a less occasion could have little merited forgiveness. Unable either to remove from the place or view distinctly what their eyes were fixed upon, they stayed till the whole cavalcade was past, then went down and threw themselves upon the floor, where their ears were deafened by the noise of guns, loud huzzas, and other testimonies of popular rejoicings, both within and without the prison walls. What have we now to expect? cried one. Endless slavery, chains, infamy, lasting as our lives, replied another. Then let us die, added a third. Right, said his companion fiercely, the glory of Sweden is lost. Let us disappoint these barbarians, these Russian monsters, of the pleasure of insulting us on our country's fall. In this romantic and distracted manner did they in vain endeavour to discharge their breasts of the load of anguish each sustained. Their misfortune was not of a nature to be alleviated by words. It was too mighty for expression, and the more they spoke, the more they had yet to say. For 3 whole days they refused the wretched sustenance brought to them, neither did the least slumber ever close their eyelids by night. On the 4th, the keeper of the prison came, and told them they must depart. They endeavoured not to inform themselves how or where they were to be disposed of. In their present condition, all places were alike to them, so followed him without speaking down stairs, at the bottom of which they found a strong guard of 30 soldiers, who having chained them in a link, like slaves going to be sold at market, conducted them to a very stately palace adjoining to that belonging to the Czar. They were but 8 in number, out of 55, who had been taken prisoner at the time Horatio was, and were thrown all together into the dungeon, the others having perished through cold and the noisomeness of the place, before Edella had procured them a more easy situation. But these 8 that survived were all officers, and most of them men of distinguished birth as well as valour, though their long imprisonment, scanty food, and more than all, the grief they at present laboured under, made them look rather like ghosts than men chose out of thousands to fight always near the King of Sweden's person, in every hazardous attempt. They were placed in a stately gallery, and there left, while the officer who commanded the party that came with them went into an inner room, but soon after returned, and another person with him, on which the first of this unhappy string was loosed from his companions, and a signal made to him to enter a door, which was opened for him and immediately closed again. For about half an hour there was a profound silence. Our prisoners kept it through astonishment, and the others, it is to be supposed, had orders for doing so. At the end of that time the door was again opened, and the chain which fastened the second Swede to the others was untied, and he, in like manner as the former, bid to go in. In some time after, the same ceremony was observed to a third, then a 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. Horatio chanced to be last, who, though alarmed to a very great degree at the thoughts of what fate might have been inflicted on his companions, went fearless in, more curious to know the meaning of this mysterious proceeding than anxious for what might befall him. He had no sooner passed the door than he found himself in a spacious chamber richly adorned, at the upper end of which sat a man, leaning his head upon his arm in a thoughtful posture. Horatio immediately knew him to be Prince Menzikoff, whom he had seen during a short truce between the Czar and King Charles of Sweden, when both their armies were in Lithuania. There were no other persons present than one who had the aspect of a Jew, and as it proved was so, that stood near the prince's chair, and a soldier who kept the door. Horatio was bid to approach, and when he did so, You are called hither, said the Jew in the Swedish language, to answer to such questions as shall be asked you, concerning a conspiracy carried on between you and your fellow prisoners with the enemies of Russia. Horatio understood the language perfectly well, having conversed so long with Swedes, but never could attain to a perfect pronunciation of it, so replied in French, that he knew the prince could speak French, and he would therefore answer to any interrogatories his highness should be pleased to make, without the help of an interpreter. Are you not then a Swede? said the prince. Horatio then told him he was not, but came from France into the service of the King of Sweden, merely through his love of arms. On these words Menzikoff dismissed the Jew, and looked earnestly on him. Wan and pale as he was grown through his long confinement, and the many hardships he had sustained, this prince found something in him that attracted his admiration. Methinks, said he, since glory was your aim, you might as well have hoped to acquire it under the banners of our invincible emperor. Alas, my lord, replied Horatio with a sigh, that title till very lately was given to the King of Sweden, and I believe, whatever fate has attended that truly great prince, those who had the honour to be distinguished by him will never be suspected either of cowardice or baseness. It was by brave and open means our king taught his soldiers the way to victory, not by mean subterfuges and little plots. I cannot therefore conceive for what reason I am brought hither to be examined on any score that has the appearance of a conspiracy. Yes, replied the prince fiercely, you and your fellow prisoners have endeavoured to insinuate yourselves into the favour of persons whom you imagined entrusted with the secrets of the government. Being prisoners of war, you formed contrivances for your escape, and attempted to inveigle others to accompany your flight. That every tittle of this accusation is false, my lord, cried Horatio, there needs no more than the improbability of it to prove. Indeed, the cruel usage we sustained might have justified an attempt to free ourselves, yet did such a design never enter our heads. We were so far from making use of any stratagems for that purpose, that we never made the least overture to any of the guards, who were the only persons we were allowed to converse with. How, said the prince, interrupting him, were not your privileges enlarged by the interposition of a lady? Did she not make you considerable allowances out of her own purse, and frequently visit you to receive your thanks? And were you not emboldened by these favours to urge her to reveal what secrets were in her knowledge, and even to assist you in your escape? You doubtless imagined you could prevail on her also to go with you. Part of this, continued he, she has herself confessed. It will therefore be in vain for you to deny it. If you ingenuously reveal these particulars she has omitted, you may hope to find favour. But if you obstinately persist, as your companions have done, in attempting to impose upon me, you must expect to share the same fate immediately. In speaking these words, he made a sign to the soldier, who, throwing open a large folding door, discovered a rack on which one of the Swedish officers was tied, and the others stood near bound, and in the hands of the executioner. This sight so amazed Horatio, that he had not the power of speaking one word, till Mullern, who happened to be the person that was fastened upon the rack, cried out to him. Be not lost in consideration, Horatio, said he. Are we not in the hands of Muscovites, from whom nothing that is human can be expected? Rather prepare yourself to disappoint their cruelty by bravely suffering all they dare inflict. Hold then, said Horatio, even Muscovites would choose to have some pretence for what they do, and sure the first favourite and generalissimo of a prince, who boasts an inclination to civilize his barbarous subjects, will not without any cause torture them, whom chance alone has put into his power, and who have never done him any personal injury. By heaven, pursued he, turning to the prince, we are all innocent of any part of those crimes laid to our charge. Time, perhaps, if our declarations are ineffectual, will convince your highness we are so, and you will then regret the injustice you have done us. You are all in one story, cried the prince, but I am well assured of the main point. The particulars is all I want to be informed of. But since I am compelled to speak more plain, which of you is it for whose sake you all received such instances of Idella's bounty? Whoever tells me that, even though it be the person himself, shall have both pardon and liberty. Impossible it is to express the astonishment every one was in at this demand. 5 of them had not the least notion what it meant, but Mullern, Horatio, and that friend to whom he had shown the letter of Mattakesa, had some conjecture of the truth, and presently imagined that lady had been the incendiary to kindle the flame of jealousy in the prince's breast. The affair, however, was of so nice a nature that they knew not how to vindicate Edella without making her seem more guilty, so contented themselves with joining with the others in protesting they knew of no one among them who could boast of receiving any greater favours from her than his fellows, but that what she did was instigated merely by compassion, since she had never seen or knew who any of them were, till after she had moved the governor on their behalf. They acknowledged she had been so good as to come sometimes to the prison, in order to see if those she entrusted with her bounty had been faithful in the delivery of it, but that she never made the least difference between them, and never had conversation with any one of them that was not in the presence of them all. Mullern could not forbear adding to this, that he doubted not but the persons who had incensed his highness into groundless surmises were also the same who had hindered her, by some false insinuations or other, from continuing the allowance her charity allowed them, and for the want of which they had since been near perishing. Prince Menzikoff listened attentively to what each said, and with no less earnestness fixed his eyes on the face of every one as they spoke. Finding they had done, he was about giving some orders on their account, when the keeper of the prison came hastily into the room, and having entreated pardon for the interruption, presented a letter to the prince, directed for the Brigadier Mullern, and brought, he said, just after the prisoners were carried out. Menzikoff commended his zeal on receiving and bringing it to him, as it might possibly serve to give some light to the affair he was examining. Having perused it, he demanded which of them was named Mullern. I am, replied the brave Swede, and neither fear nor am ashamed of anything under that name. Hear then what is wrote to you by a lady, resumed the prince, with a countenance more serene than he had worn since their being brought before him, and presently read with a very audible voice these words: That you have been so long without seeing me, my dear Mullern, or hearing from me, is not owing to any decrease in my affection, but to the necessity of my affairs. If you have any regard for me remaining, I conjure you, if ever you are asked any questions concerning the frequent visits I have made you, to say I was sent by Edella, and that I was no more than her emissary in the assistance you received from me. Add also that you have reason to believe her charity was excited by her liking one of your company. Mention who you think fit, but I believe Horatio, as the youngest and most handsome, will be the most likely to gain credit to what you say. Depend on it, that if you execute this commission artfully, I will recompense it by procuring your liberty, nor need you have any scruples concerning it, for no person will be prejudiced by it, and the reputation preserved of yours, Mattakesa. I suppose, said the prince, as soon as he had done reading, turning to Horatio, you are the person mentioned in the letter? Though I neither desire nor deserve the epithets given me there, my lord, replied he, yet I will not deny but I am called Horatio. Well, resumed the prince with a half smile, I am so well pleased with the conviction this letter has given me, that I shall retain no resentment against the malicious author of it. He then ordered Mullern to be taken from the rack, which had never been strained, nor had he any intention, as he now assured them, to put him to the torture, but only to intimidate him, being resolved to make use of every method he could think of for the full discovery of everything relating to the behaviour of his beloved Edella. The other gentlemen also had their fetters taken off, and the prince asked pardon of them severally for the injury he had done them, then made them sit down and partake of a handsome collation at that table before which they had so lately stood as delinquents at the bar. The Russians are excessive in their carouses, and Prince Menzikoff, being now in an admirable good humour, made them drink very freely. To be the more obliging to his guests, he began the King of Sweden's health in a bumper of brandy, protesting at the same time that though an enemy to his master, he loved and venerated the hero. Horatio on this ventured to inquire in what condition his majesty was, to which the prince replied that being greatly wounded, he was obliged to leave the field, and it was believed had took the load towards the dominions of the Grand Signior, some of the Russian troops having pursued him as far as the Borysthenes, where, by the incredible valour of a few that attended him, they had been beat back. The Swedish officers knew it must be bad indeed when their king was compelled to fly, and this renewed in them a melancholy which it was not in the power of liquor or the present civilities of the prince to dissipate. They also learned that the generals Renchild, Slippenbock, Hamilton, Horn, Leuenhaupt and Stackelberg, with the Prince of Würtemberg, Count Piper, and the flower of the whole army, were prisoners at Moscow. The misfortune of these great men would have been very afflicting to those who heard it, could anything have given addition to what they knew before. Prince Menzikoff was sensible of what they felt, and to alleviate their grief, assured them that he would take upon him to give them all their liberty, without even exacting a promise from them never more to draw their swords against the Czar, in case the King of Sweden should ever be able to take the field again. So generous a proceeding both merited and received their utmost acknowledgments, but he put an end to the serious demonstrations they were about to make him of their gratitude, by saying, I pay you no more than I owe you. I have wronged you. This is but part of the retaliation I ought to make. Besides, added he, laughing, Mattakesa promised Mullern his freedom, and as she has done me the good office, though undesignedly, of revealing to me her own treachery, I can do no less than assist her in fulfilling her covenant. To prove how much he was in earnest, he called his secretary, and ordered him to make out their passports with all expedition, that they might be ready to depart next morning, after which he made them repose themselves in his palace the remainder of the night, which being in a manner vastly different from what they had been accustomed to of a long time, indeed ever since their quitting Alrenstadt, they did not fail to do, notwithstanding the discontent of their minds. Prince Menzikoff, now being convinced of the fidelity of Edella, passed into her apartment, where the reconciliation between them took up so much time, that it was near noon next day before he appeared. His new guests had not quitted their chambers much sooner, but after reproaching themselves for having been so tardy, went all together to take leave of the prince, and accept the passports he had been so good as to order. As they were got ready, he gave them immediately into their hands, and told them they were at liberty to quit Petersburg that moment if they pleased, or if they had any curiosity to take a view of that city, they might gratify it and begin their journey next morning. As it was now so late in the day, they accepted his highness's offer, and walked out to see a place which had excited so much admiration in the world, since from a wild waste, in 10 years' time, a spacious and most beautiful city had arose in the midst of war, and proved the genius of the founder greater in civil than in military arts, though it must be owned he was indefatigable in the study of both. The officers of the King of Sweden were entertained with the same elegance and good humour they had been the night before, and as they were now resolved to quit the city extremely early, the prince took leave of them that night, and in doing so put a purse of gold into the hands of every one to defray the expenses of their travelling. This behaviour obliged them to own there was a possibility of sowing the seeds of humanity in Muscovy, and that the Czar had made some progress in influencing those about him with the manners he had himself learned in the politer courts. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 22. What befell Louisa in the monastery, the stratagem she put in practice to get out of it, her travels through Italy, and arrival in Paris. But while Horatio was thus experiencing the vicissitudes of fortune, his beautiful sister suffered little less from the caprice of that fickle goddess. Placed as she was, one would have thought she had been secure from all the temptations, hurries, and dangers of the world, and that nothing but the death or inconstancy of Monsieur de Plessis could have again involved her in them. These indeed were the sole evils she trembled at, and which she chiefly prayed might not befall her. Yet, as it often happens that those disasters which seem most remote are nearest to us, so did the disappointments she was ordained to suffer rise from a quarter she had the least reason to apprehend. The abbess and nuns with whom she was, being all Italians, she set herself to attain to the knowledge of their language, in which she soon became a very great proficient, and capable of entertaining them, and being entertained by them, in the most agreeable manner. The sweetness of her temper, as well as her good sense, rendering her always ambitious of acquiring the affection of those she converted with, she had the secret to ingratiate herself not only to the youngest nuns, but also to the elder and most austere, that the one were never pleased but when in her company, and the others propose her as an example of piety and sweetness to the rest. She had a very pretty genius to poetry, and great skill in music, both which talents she now exercised in such works as suited the place and company she was in. The hymns and anthems she composed were not only the admiration of that convent, but also of several others by whom they were shown, and she was spoke of as a prodigy of wit and devotion. In fine, her behaviour rendered her extremely dear to the superior, and that affection, joined to a spiritual pride, which those sanctified devotees are seldom wholly free from, made her very desirous of retaining her always in the convent. She was therefore continually preaching up to her the uncertainty of those felicities which are to be found in the world, and magnifying that happy serenity which a total renunciation from it afforded. Nay, sometimes went so far as to insinuate there was scarce a possibility for any one encumbered with the cares and surrounded with the temptations of a public life to have those dispositions which are requisite to enjoy the blessings of futurity. Ah, my dear daughter, would she say frequently to her, how much should I rejoice to find in you a desire to forego all the transitory fleeting pleasures of the world, and devote yourself entirely to heaven. What raptures would not your innocent soul partake, when wholly devoid of all thoughts of sensual objects! You would be, even while on earth, a companion for angels and blessed spirits, and borne on the wings of heavenly contemplation, have your dwelling above, and be worshipped as a saint below. All the old nuns, and some of the young ones, assisted the abbess in endeavouring to prevail on Louisa to take the veil, but all that they said made no impression on her mind, not but she had more real piety than perhaps some of those who made so great a show of it, but she was of a different way of thinking, and though she knew the world had its temptation, having experienced them in a very great degree, yet she was convinced within herself that a person of virtuous principles might be no less innocent out of a cloister than in one. She saw also among this sisterhood a great deal of envy to each other, and perceived early that the flaming zeal professed among them was in some hypocrisy and enthusiasm in others, so that had she had no prepossession in favour of du Plessis or any engagement with him, the life of a nun was what she never should have made choice of. She kept her sentiments on this occasion entirely to herself, however, and made no show of any repugnance to do as they would have her, but whenever they became strenuous in their pressures, told them She doubted not but such a life as they described must be very angelic, but having already disposed of her vows, it was not in her power to withdraw them, nor would heaven accept so violated an offering. This, they told her, was only a suggestion of some evil spirit, and that all engagements to an earthly object both might and ought to be dispensed with for a divine vocation. The arguments they made use of for this purpose were artful enough to have imposed on some minds, but Louisa had too much penetration not to see through them, and being unwilling to disoblige them by shewing that she did so, made use in her turn of evasions which the circumstances of the case rendered very excusable. But fully persuaded in their minds that it was solely her engagements with du Plessis that rendered her so refractory to their desires, they resolved to break it off if possible, and to that end now intercepted his letters, two of which, giving an account that he was very much wounded and unable to travel, they renewed their pressures, in order to prevail on her to take the habit before he should be in a condition to come to Bologna. These solicitations, however, had no other effect than to embitter the satisfaction she would otherwise have enjoyed during her stay among them, the time of which began now to seem tedious, and she impatiently longed for the end of the campaign, which she expected would return her dear du Plessis to her, and she should be removed from a place where dissimulation, a vice she detested, was in a manner necessary. She had received several letters from him before the abbess took it into her head to stop them, each more endearing than the former, and last had flattered her with the hope of seeing him in a very short time. Days, weeks, and months passed over after an assurance so pleasing to her wishes, without any confirmation of the repeated vows he had made, and receiving from him no account of the reasons that delayed him, she began to reproach herself for having placed too much confidence in him. The more time elapsed, the more cause she had to doubt his sincerity and believe her misfortune real. In fine, it was near half a year that she languished under a vain expectation of seeing, or at least hearing from him. Sometimes she imagined a new object had deprived her of his heart, but when she called to mind the many proofs he had given her of the most unparalleled generosity that ever was, she could not think that even if he ceased to love her, he could be capable of leaving her in so cruel a suspense. No, said she to herself, he would have let me know I had no more to depend on from him. Paper cannot blush, and as he is out of the reach of my upbraidings, he would certainly have acquainted me with my fate, confessed the inconstancy of his sex, and exerted that wit of which he has sufficient to have excused his change. I will not therefore injure a man whom I have found so truly noble. Death, perhaps, has deprived me of him. The unrelenting sword makes no distinction between the worthy and unworthy, and the brave, the virtuous du Plessis may have fallen a victim in common with the most vulgar. These apprehensions had no sooner gained ground in her imagination than she became the most disconsolate creature in the world. The abbess took advantage of her melancholy, as knowing the occasion of it, and began to represent in the strongest terms the instability of all human expectations. You may easily see, my dear child, said she, that monsieur either no longer lives or ceases to live for you. Young men are wavering. Every new object attracts their wishes. They are impatient for a time, but soon grow cool. Absence renders them forgetful of their vows and promises. There is no real dependence on them. Fly therefore to that divine love which never can deceive you. Give yourself up to heaven, and you will soon be enabled to despise the fickle hopes of earth. Instead of saying anything to comfort her, in this manner was she continually persecuted, and though it is impossible for any one to have less inclination to a monastic life than she had, yet the depression of her spirits, the firm belief she now should never see du Plessis more, the misfortune of her circumstances, joined to the artifices they made use of, and the repeated offers of accepting her without the usual sum paid on such occasions, might possibly at last have prevailed on her. She was half convinced in her mind that it was the only asylum left to shield her from the wants and insults of the world, and the more she reflected on the changes, the perplexities and vexation of different kinds the few years she yet had lived had presented her with, the more reason she found to acquiesce with the persuasions of the abbess. But heaven would not suffer the deceit practised on her to be crowned with success, and discovered it to her timely enough to prevent her from giving too much way to that despair which alone could have prevailed with her to yield to their importunities. There was among the sisterhood a young lady called Donna Leonora, who, being one of many daughters of a family more eminent for birth than riches, was compelled, as too many are, to become a nun, in order to prevent her marrying beneath her father's dignity. She had taken a great liking to Louisa from the moment she came into the convent, and a farther acquaintance ripened it into sincere friendship. Though secluded from the world, the austere air of a monastery had no effect on her. She still retained her former vivacity, and it was only in the conversations these two had together, whenever they could separate from the others, that Louisa found any cordial to revive her now almost sinking spirits. One day, as she was ruminating on her melancholy affairs, this young nun came hastily into her chamber, and with a countenance that, before she spoke, denoted she had something very extraordinary to acquaint her with. Dear sister, cried she, I bring you the most surprising news, but such as will be my ruin if you take the least notice of receiving it from me, and perhaps your own if you seem to be acquainted with it at all. It is not to be doubted that Louisa gave her all the assurances she could desire of an inviolable secrecy, after which, know then, resumed this sweet conditioned lady, that your lover, Monsieur de Plessis, is not only living, but as faithful as your soul can wish, or as you once believed. The cruelty of the abbess, and some of the sisterhood in the plot with her, have concealed the letters he has sent to you, in order to persuade you to become a nun. I tremble to think of their hypocrisy and deceit. But what, continued she, is not to be expected from bigotry and enthusiasm? To increase the number of devotees they scruple nothing, and vainly imagine the means is sanctified by the end. Little is it in the power of words to express the astonishment Louisa was in to hear her speak in this manner; but as she had no room to doubt her sincerity, only asked, by what means she had attained the knowledge of what the persons concerned, no doubt, intended to keep as much a secret as possible, on which the other satisfied her curiosity in these terms. To confess the truth to you, said she, I stole this afternoon into the chapel, in order to read a little book brought me the other day by one of my friends. As it treated on a subject not allowable in a convent, I thought that the most proper place to entertain myself with it, and was sitting down in one of the confessionals, when, hearing the little door open from the gallery, I saw the abbess and sister Clara, who you know is her favourite and confidant, come in together, and as soon as they were entered, shut the door after them. I cannot say I had any curiosity to hear their discourse, but fearing to be suspected by them in my amusement, and not knowing what excuse to make for being there if I was seen, I slid down and lay close at the bottom of the confessional. They happened to place themselves very near me, and the abbess, taking a letter out of her pocket, bade Clara read it, and tell her the substance of it as well as she could. I found it was in French by some words which she was obliged to repeat over and over, before, not perfectly understanding the language, she could be able to find a proper interpretation of. The abbess, who has a little smattering of it herself, sometimes helped her out, and between them both I soon found it came from Monsieur de Plessis, and contained the most tender and compassionate complaint of your unkindness in not answering his letter. That the symptoms he had of approaching death were not half so severe to him as your refusing him a consolation he stood for much in need of. That if you found him unworthy of your love, he was certainly so of your compassion, and concluded with the most earnest entreaty you would suffer him to continue no longer in a suspense more cruel than 1,000 deaths could be. Oh heaven! cried Louisa, bursting into tears, how ungrateful must he think me, and how can I return, as it deserves, so unexampled a constancy after such seeming proofs of my infidelity? Cruel, cruel, treacherous abbess, pursued she, is this the fruits of all your boasted sanctity? This the return to the confidence the generous du Plessis reposed in you? This your love and friendship to me? Does heaven, to increase the number of its votaries, require you to be false, perfidious, and injurious to the world? She was proceeding in giving vent to the anguish of her soul in exclamations such as these, but Leonora begged she would moderate her grief, and for her sake, as much as possible, conceal the reasons she had for resentment. Louisa again promised she would do her utmost to keep them from thinking she even suspected they had played her false, then cried, but tell me, my dear Leonora, were they not a little moved at the tender melancholy which, I perceive, ran through this epistle? Alas, my dear, replied the other, they have long since forgot those soft emotions which make us sympathize in the woes of love. Inflexible by the rigid rules of this place, and more by their own age, they rather looked with horror than pity on a tender inclination. They had a long conversation together, the result of which was to spare nothing that might either persuade, or if that failed, compel you to take the order. It is not in their power to do the latter, interrupted Louisa, and this discovery of their baseness more than ever confirms me in the resolution never to consent. You know not what is in their power, said Leonora. They may make pretences for confining you here, which, as they are under no jurisdiction but the church will allow justifiable. Indeed, Louisa, continued she, I should be loath to see you have recourse to force to get out of their hands, which would only occasion you ill treatment. To whom, alas, can you complain? You are a stranger in this country, without any one friend to espouse your cause. Were even du Plessis here in person, I know not, as they have taken it into their heads to keep you here, if all he could urge, either to the Pope or confessory, would have any weight to oblige them to relinquish you. A convent is the securest prison in the world, and whenever any one comes into it, who by any particular endowment promises to be an ornament to the order, cannot without great difficulty disentangle themselves from the snares laid for them. It is for this reason I have feared for you ever since your entrance, for though I should rejoice in so agreeable a companion, I know too well the miseries of an enforced attachment to wish you to be a partaker of it. Louisa found too much reason in what she said to doubt the misery of her condition. She knew the great power of the church in all these countries where the Roman Catholic religion is established, more especially in those places under papal jurisdiction, and saw no way to avoid what was now more terrible to her than ever. Those reflections threw her into such agonies that Leonora had much ado to keep her from falling into fits. She conjured her again and again never to betray what she had entrusted her with, assuring her that if it was so much as guessed at, she should be exposed to the worst treatment, and punished as an enemy to the order of which she was a member. Louisa as often assured her that nothing should either tempt or provoke her to abuse that generous friendship she had testified for her; but as she was not able to command her countenance, though she could her words, she resolved to pretend herself indisposed and keep to her bed, that she might be the less observed, or the change in her should seem rather the effect of ill health than any secret discontent. It was no sooner mentioned in the convent that she was out of order, than the abbess herself, as well as the whole sisterhood, came to her chamber and shewed the greatest concern. The tender care they took of her would have made her think herself infinitely obliged to them, and perhaps gone a great way in engaging her continuance among them, had she not been apprized of their falsehood in a point so little to be forgiven. So great an enemy was she to all deceit herself, that it was difficult for her to return the civilities they treated her with, as they might seem to deserve. But whatever omissions she was guilty of in this particular were imputed to her disposition, and the whole convent continued to be extremely assiduous to recover her. During the time of her feigned illness, her thoughts were always employed on the means of getting away. Whenever Leonora and she were together, 100 contrivances were formed, which seemed equally alike impracticable; but at length they hit upon one which had a promising aspect, and Louisa, after some scruples, resolved to make trial of it. It was this: as hypocrisy was made use of to detain her, hypocrisy was the only method by which she could hope to get her liberty. Pretending therefore to be all at once restored to her former health, she sent to entreat the abbess and some other of the most zealous of the sisterhood to come into her chamber, where, as soon as they entered, they found her on her knees before the picture of the Virgin, and seeming in an ecstasy of devotion. Yes, holy Virgin, cried she, as if too much taken up to see who entered, I will obey your commands. I will devote myself entirely to thee. I will follow where thou callest me. Thou who hast restored me shall have the first fruits of my strength. And oh, that Loretto were at a greater distance! To the utmost extent of land and sea would I go to seek thee. In uttering these ejaculations she prostrated herself on the floor, then rising again, as transported in a manner out of herself, I come, cried she, still do I hear thy heavenly voice. In this fit of enthusiasm did she remain for above half an hour, and so well acted her part, that the abbess, who would not offer to interrupt her, believed it real, and was in little less agitation of spirit than Louisa pretended to be. At length, seeming to come to herself, she turned towards the company, as though she but just then discovered they were in the room. Oh, madam, said she to the abbess, how highly favoured have I been this blessed night! The Virgin has herself appeared to me, whether in a vision or to my waking eyes, I cannot well determine, but sure I have been in such ecstasies, have felt such divine raptures, as no words can express. Oh, my dear daughter, cried the abbess, how my soul kindles to behold this change in thee! But tell me, what said the Holy Virgin? She bade me wait on her at Loretto, answered she, and gave me hopes of doing something wonderful in my favour. I will therefore, with your permission, undertake a pilgrimage, and at her shrine expiate the offences of my past life in tears of true contrition, and then return, a pure and fearless partaker of the happiness you enjoy in an uninterrupted course of devotion. Oh, exclaimed she, exalting her voice, how do I detest and despise the vanities and follies of the world! How hate myself for having been too much attached to them, and so long been cold and negligent of my only happiness! The abbess, and after her all the nuns that were present, embraced Louisa, praised to the skies the miraculous conversion, as they termed it, and spared nothing to confirm the pious resolution she had taken. In fine, they consented to her pilgrimage with a satisfaction equal to what she felt in undertaking it. They not in the least doubting but she would return to them as soon as she had fulfilled her devotions, and flattering themselves that the report of this miracle would do the greatest honour to their convent that it could possibly receive, and she delighted with the thoughts of being at liberty to inquire after her dear du Plessis, and being freed from a dissimulation so irksome to her nature. Her pilgrim's habit, and a great crucifix to carry between her hands, with another at her girdle, and all the formalities of that garb being prepared, she set forward with the prayers and benedictions of the whole sisterhood, who told her that they should be impatient till they saw her again, and expected great things from her at her return, which in reality they all did, except Leonora, who laughed heartily at the deception she had put upon them, and whispered in her ear, as she gave her the last embrace, that she wished her a happy meeting with that saint she went in search of. To prevent all suspicion of her intention, she left her clothes and everything she had brought into the convent under the care of the abbess, saying that at her return she would have them disposed of, and the money given to the poor. But unknown to any one except Leonora, she quilted some pieces of gold and valuable trinkets into her undergarment, as not doubting but she should have occasion for much more than, in effect, she was mistress of. When on her journey, the pleasure she felt at seeing herself out of the walls of the monastery was very much abated by the uncertainty how she should proceed, or where direct her way; and indeed, let any one figure to themselves the condition she was in, and they will rather wonder she had the courage to go on, than that she was sometimes daunted even to despair. A young creature of little more than 18 years old, wholly unacquainted with fatigue, delicate in her frame, wandering alone, on foot, in the midst of a strange country, ignorant of the road, or had she been acquainted with it, at a loss where to go to get any intelligence of what she sought, and even doubtful if the person she ran such risks to hear of yet were in the world or not. The letter Leonora had informed her of gave no account, at least that she could learn, either where he was, or whether there was any hopes of his recovery from that illness it mentioned. She had therefore everything to dread, and little, very little to hope. Yet did she not repent having quitted the convent, and the desire of getting still farther from it made her prosecute her journey with greater strength and vigour than could have been expected. Her pilgrim's habit was not only a defence against any insults from persons she met on the road, but also attracted the respect and engaged the civilities of every one. As that country abounds with religious houses, she was not only lodged and fed without any expense, but received a piece of money at each of them she went to, so that her little stock, instead of being diminished, was considerably increased when she came to Loretto, for thither, not to be false in everything, she went, and being truly sorry for the hypocrisy which a sad necessity alone could have made her guilty of, paid her devotion with a sincere heart, though free from that enthusiasm and bigotry which is too much practised in convents. From Loretto she crossed the country to Florence, every one being ready to direct a holy pilgrim on her way, and assist her with all things necessary. As she went very easy journeys, never exceeding 4 or 5 miles a day, she easily supported the fatigue, and had she been certain at last of seeing du Plessis, it would have been rather a pleasure to her. But her mind suffered much more than her body during the pilgrimage, which she continued in the same manner she had begun till she reached Leghorn, where a ship lying at anchor, and expecting to sail in a few days for Marseilles, she agreed to give a small matter for her passage, the seafaring men not paying altogether so much regard to her habit as the land ones had done. No ill accident intervening, the vessel came safely into her desired port, and Louisa now found herself in the native country of the only person who engrossed her thoughts. As she had heard him say he was of Paris, she supposed that the most likely place to hear news of him, but was in some debate with herself whether she should continue to wear her pilgrim's habit, or provide herself with other clothes at Marseilles. She was weary of this mendicant way of travelling, and could have been glad to have exchanged it for one more agreeable to the manner in which she had been accustomed. But then, when she considered how great a protection the appearance she made had been from all those insults to which a person of her sex and age must otherwise infallibly have been exposed in travelling alone, she resolved not to throw it off till she came to the place where she intended to take up her abode, at least for some time. Young as she was, she had well weighed what course to take in case du Plessis should either be dead, or by some accident removed where she could hear nothing more of him; and all countries and parts being now equal to her, as she must then be reduced once more to get her bread by her labour, she doubted not but to find encouragement for her industry as well in Paris as elsewhere. With this resolution, therefore, after laying one night at Marseilles, she proceeded on her way in the same fashion she had done ever since she left Bologna, and in about 6 weeks got safely to that great and opulent city, where she took up her lodging at a hotel, extremely fatigued, as it is easy to believe, having never even for one day ceased walking, but while she was on board the ship which brought her to Marseilles for the space of 8 months, a thing almost incredible, and what perhaps no woman but herself would have had courage to undertake or resolution to perform, but was, in her circumstances, infinitely the most safe and expedient that prudence could suggest. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 23 shows by what means Louisa came to the knowledge of her parents, with other occurrences. The first thing she did on her arrival was to send for proper persons to equip her in a manner that she might once more appear herself, resolving that till she could do so not to be seen in the streets. While these things were preparing, she sent a person, whom the people of the house recommended to her, to the palace of the Prince of Conti, not doubting but that some of the gentlemen belonging to his highness might give some intelligence where monsieur de Plessis was to be found. But the messenger returned without any other information than that they knew him very well, but could give no directions in what part he was at present, not having been seen in Paris for a long time. It is hard to say whether she most rejoiced or grieved at this account. She imagined that had he been dead, they would not have been ignorant of it, therefore concluded him living to her infinite satisfaction, but then his absenting himself from the capital of the kingdom, and from the presence of a prince who he had so much loved, filled her with an adequate disquiet, as believing some very ill accident must have been the occasion. She dispatched the same person afterwards to all the public places that she heard gentlemen frequented, but met not with the least success in her enquiries. It would prolong this narrative to a tedious length, should I attempt any description of what she felt in this situation, or the reflections she made on the odd circumstances of her life. The greatness of her spirit, and the most perfect resignation to the divine will, however, made her support even this last and severest trial with fortitude and patience, and as soon as she had put herself into a convenient neat garb, but plain, befitting her condition, she went out with a design to take a private lodging, where she might live more cheaply than she could at the hotel, till Providence should throw some person in the way that might recommend her either to work or to teach young ladies music. She was wandering through several of the streets of Paris, without being able as yet to find such a chamber as she wanted, when a great shower of rain happening to fall, she stood up under the porch of a large house for shelter till it should be over, which it was not for a considerable time, and the street being very dirty, she returned to the hotel, intending to renew her search the next day. She had not been come in above half an hour before the man of the house told her that a servant in very rich livery, who he perceived had followed her and had asked many questions concerning her, was now returned and desired to speak with her. As du Plessis was ever in her thoughts, a sudden rush of joy overflowed her heart, which seemed to her the presage of seeing him, though how he should imagine she was in Paris was a mystery. But she gave herself not much time for reflection before she ordered the man to be admitted. The manner of his approaching her was very respectful, but the message he had to deliver seemed of a contrary nature. After having asked her if her name was Louisa, and she answering that it was, I come, madam, said he, from a gentleman who saw you stand just now at the gate of a house in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. He commands me to tell you that he has something of moment to acquaint you with, and desires you will permit me to call a chair and attend you to his house, where he is impatient to receive you. What indeed could Louisa think of a person who should send for her in this manner? All the late transport she was in was immediately converted into disdain and vexation at being taken, as she had all the reason in the world to suppose, for one of those common creatures who prostitute their charms for bread. Tell your master, said she, that by whatever accident he has learned my name, he is wholly ignorant of the character of the person he has sent you to, that I am an entire stranger at Paris, and he must have mistaken me for some other, who perhaps I may have the misfortune to resemble, and may be also called as I am. At least I am willing to think so, as the only excuse can be made for his offering this insult. But go, continued she, with the pride which is natural to the affronted virtue, go and convince him of his error, and let me hear no more of it. It was in vain he assured her that his master was a person of the highest honour, and that he was not unknown to her. All he could say had not the least effect, unless to inflame her more, when, after asking his name, the fellow told her he was forbid to reveal it, but that he was confident she would not deny having been acquainted with him when once she saw him. I shall neither own the one, cried she, nor consent to the other. Then bid him a second time be gone, with an air which shewed she was not to be prevailed upon to listen to his arguments. The man had no sooner left her than she fell into a deep study, from which a sudden thought made her immediately start. The Count de Bellfleur came into her head, and she was certain it could be no other than that cruel persecutor of her virtue that her ill fate had once more thrown in her way. As she knew very well by what he had done that he was of a disposition to scruple nothing for the attainment of his wishes, she trembled for the consequences of his discovering where she was. The only way she could think on to avoid the dangers she might be exposed to on his account, was to draw up a petition to the Prince of Conti, acquainting him that she was the person who was near suffering so much from the ill designs he had on her at Padua, when so generously referred by Monsieur de Plessis, and to entreat his highness's protection against any attempts he might be safe enough to make. She was just sitting down in order to form a remonstrance of this kind, when a chariot and 6 stopping at the door, she was informed the gentleman who had sent to her was come in person, and that they knew it was the same by the livery. Louisa run hastily to the window and saw a person alight, whom by the bulk and stature she knew could not be the count she so much dreaded, this having much the advantage of the other in both. Somewhat reassured by this sight, she ordered the master of the hotel to desire him to walk into a parlour, and let him know she would attend him there. As she saw not the face of this visitor, she could not be certain whether it were not some of those she had been acquainted with at Venice, who having by accident seen her at Paris, might, according to the freedom of the French nation, take the liberty of visiting her. But whoever it were, or on what score soever brought, she thought it best to receive him in a place where, in case of any ill usage, she might readily have assistance. The master of the hotel, perceiving her scruples, readily did as he was ordered, and Louisa, having desired that he or some of his people would be within call, went down to receive this unknown gent, though not without emotions which at that moment she knew not how to account for. But soon after she was seized with infinitely greater, when entering the parlour, she found it was no other than Dorilaus who had given her this anxiety. Surprize at the sight of a person whom, of all the world, she could least have expected in that place, made her at first start back, and conscious shame for having, as she thought, so ill rewarded his goodness, mixed with a certain awe, which she had for no other person but himself, occasioned such a trembling as rendered her unable either to retire or move forward to salute him, as she otherwise would have done. He saw the confusion she was in, and willing to give it an immediate relief, ran to her, and taking her in his arms, my dear, dear child, said he, am I so happy to see thee once more? Oh, sir, returned she, disengaging herself from his embrace and falling at his feet, how can I look upon you? after having flown from your protection, and given you such cause to think me the most ungrateful creature in the world. It was heaven, answered he, that inspired you with that abhorrence of my offers, which, had you accepted, we must both have been eternally undone. You are my daughter, Louisa, pursued he, my own natural daughter. Rise then and take a father's blessing. All that can be said of astonishment would be far short of what she felt at these words. The happiness seemed so great, she could not think it real, though uttered from a mouth she knew unaccustomed to deceit. 100 times, without giving him leave to satisfy her doubts, did she cry out, my father, my real father, how can it be? Is there a possibility that Louisa owes her being to Dorilaus? Yes, my dear Louisa, answered he, and flatter myself by what I have observed of your disposition, you have done nothing since our parting that might prevent my glorying in being the parent of such a child. The hurry of spirit she was in prevented her from taking notice of these last words, or at least from making any answer to them, and she still continued crying out, Dorilaus, my father! Good heaven, may I believe I am so blessed? Who then is my mother? Wherefore have I been so long ignorant of what I was? And how is the joyful secret at last revealed? All these things you shall be fully informed of, answered he. In the meantime be satisfied I do not deceive you, and am indeed your father, transported to find my long lost child, whom I myself knew not was so till I believed her gone for ever. 1,000 times have I wished both you and Horatio were my children, but little suspected you were so, till after his too eager ambition deprived me of him, and my mistaken love drove you to seek a refuge among strangers. Tears of joy and tenderness now bedewed the faces of both father and daughter. Silence for some moments succeeded the late acclamations, but Dorilaus at length, finding her fully convinced she was as happy as he said she was, and entirely freed from all those apprehensions which had occasioned her flying from him, told her he was settled in Paris, that he lived just opposite to the house where she had stood up on account of the shower, and happening to be at one of his windows, immediately knew her, that he sent a servant after her, who had inquired how long she had been arrived, and in what manner she came, that he had sent for her with no other intent than to make a trial how she would resent it, and was transported to find her answer such as he hoped and had expected from her. He added that he had all the anxiety of a father to hear by what means she had been supported, and the motive which had induced her to travel in the habit of a pilgrim, as the master of the hotel had informed his servant, but that he would defer his satisfaction till she should be in a place more becoming his daughter. On concluding these words, he called for the master of the hotel, and having defrayed what little expenses she had been at since her coming there, took her by the hand and led her to his chariot, which soon brought them to a magnificent house, and furnished in a manner answerable to the birth and fortune of the owner. Louisa had all this time seemed like one in a dream. She had ever loved Dorilaus with a filial affection, and to find herself really his daughter, to be snatched at once from all those cares which attend penury when accompanied with virtue, and an abhorrence of entering into measures inconsistent with the strictest honour, to be relieved from every want, and in a station which commanded respect and homage, was such a surcharge of felicity that she was less able to support than all the fatigues she had gone through. Surprise and joy made her appear more dull and stupid than she had ever been in her whole life before, and Dorilaus was obliged to repeat all he had said over and over again, to bring her into her usual composedness, and enable her to give him the satisfaction he required. But as soon as she had by degrees recollected herself, she modestly related all that had happened to her from the time she left him, the methods by which she endeavoured to earn her bread, the insults she was exposed to at Mrs. C.'s, the way she came acquainted with Melanthe, the kindness shown her by that lady, their travels together, the base stratagem made use of by the Count de Bellfleur to ruin her with that lady, the honourable position monsieur de Plessis had professed for her, the seasonable assistance he had given her in that imminent danger she was in from the count's unlawful designs upon her, his placing her afterwards in the monastery, the treachery of the abbess, the artifice she had been obliged to make use of to get out of the nunnery, her pilgrimage, in fine, concealed no part of her adventures, only that which related to the passion she had for du Plessis, which she endeavoured as much as she could to disguise under the name of gratitude for the obligation he had conferred upon her, and admiration of his virtue, so different from what she had found in others who had addressed her. Dorilaus, however, easily perceived the tenderness by which she was agitated on the account of that young gentleman, but would not excite her blushes by taking any notice of it, especially as he had found nothing to condemn in it, and had observed throughout the course of her whole narrative she had behaved on other occasions with a discretion far above her years. He was far from wronging her by suspecting she had swerved from it in this. But when he heard the vast journey she had come on foot, he was in the utmost amazement at her fortitude, and told her he was resolved to keep her pilgrim's habit as a relic, to preserve to after ages the memory of an adventure which had really something more marvellous in it than many set down as miracles. And now, having fully gratified his own curiosity in all he wanted to be informed of, he thought proper to case the impatience she was in to know the history of her birth, and on what occasion it had been so long concealed, which he did in these or the like words. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 24. The history of Dorilaus and Matilda, with other circumstances very important to Louisa. You know, said he, that I am descended of one of the most illustrious families in England, though by some imprudencies on one side and injustice on the other, my claim was set aside, and I deprived of that title which my ancestors for a long succession of years had enjoyed, so that the estate I am in possession of was derived to me in right of my mother, who is an heiress. It is indeed sufficient to have given me a pretence to any lady I should have made choice on, and to provide for what children I might have had by her, but the pride of my blood, being not abated in me by being cut off from my birthright, inspired me with an unconquerable aversion to marriage, since I could not bequeath to my posterity that dignity I ought to have enjoyed myself. I resolved therefore to live single, and that the misfortune of my family should die with myself. In my younger years I went to travel, as well for improvement as to alleviate that discontent which was occasioned by the sight of another in possession of what I thought was my due. Having made the tour of Europe, I took France again in my way home. The gallantry and good breeding of these people very much attached me to them, but what chiefly engaged my continuance here much longer than I had done in any other part, was an acquaintance I had made with a lady called Matilda. She was of a very good family in England, and sent to a monastery merely for the sake of well grounding her in a religion, the free exercise of which is not allowed at home, and to seclude her from settling her affections on any other than the person she was destined to by the will of her parents, and to whom she had been contracted in her infancy. She was extremely young, and beautiful as an angel, and the knowledge she was pre-engaged could not hinder me from loving her, any more than the declarations I made in her hearing against marriage could the grateful returns she was pleased to make me. In fine, the mutual inclination we had for each other, as it rendered us deaf to all suggestions but that of gratifying it, so it also inspired us with ingenuity to surmount all the difficulties that were between our wishes and the end of them. Though a pensioner in a monastery, and very closely observed, by the help of a confidant she frequently got out, and many nights we passed together, till some business relating to my estate at length calling me away, we were obliged to part, which we could not do without testifying a great deal of concern on both sides. Mine was truly sincere at that time, and I have reason to believe hers was no less so. But absence easily wears out the impressions of youth. As I never expected to see her more, I endeavoured not to preserve a remembrance which would only have given me disquiet, and, to confess the truth, soon forgot both the pleasure and the pain I had experienced in this, as well as some other little sallies of my unthinking youth. Many years passed over without my ever hearing anything of her, and it was some months after I received your letter from Aix la Chapelle that the post brought me one from Ireland. Having no correspondence in that country, I was a little surprised, but much more when I opened it and found it contained these words: To Dorilaus, Sir, this comes to make a request, which I know not if the acquaintance we had together in the early part of both our lives would be sufficient to apologize for the trouble you must take in complying with it. Permit me therefore to acquaint you that I have long laboured under an indisposition which my physicians assure me is incurable, and under which I must inevitably sink in a short time. But whatever they say, I know it is impossible for me to leave the world without imparting to you a secret wholly improper to be entrusted to a letter, but is of the utmost importance to those concerned in it, of whom yourself is the principal. Be assured it regards your honour, your conscience, your justice, as well as the eternal peace of her who conjures you with the utmost earnestness to come immediately on the receipt of this to the castle of M in the north of Ireland, where if you arrive time enough, you will be surprised, though I flatter myself not disagreeably so, with the unravelling a most mysterious event. Yours, once known by the name of Matilda, now M. I will not repeat to you, my dear Louisa, continued Dorilaus, the strange perplexity of ideas that run through my mind after having read this letter. I was very far from guessing at the real motive of the invitation, which, however, as I once had a regard for that lady, I soon determined to obey, and having left the care of my house to a relation of mine by the mother's side, I went directly for Ireland, but when I came there, was a little embarrassed in my mind what excuse I should make to her husband for my visit. Before I ventured to the castle, I made a thorough inquiry after the character of this young lady, and in what manner she lived with her lord. Never did I hear a person more universally spoke well of. The poor adored her charity, affability, and condescending sweetness of disposition. The rich admired her wit, her virtue, her good breeding. Her beauty, though allowed inferior to few of her sex, was the least qualification that seemed deserving praise. To add to all this, they told me she was a pattern of conjugal affection, and the best of mothers to a numerous race of children. That her lord had all the value he ought to have for so amiable a wife, and that no wedded pair ever lived together in greater harmony. And it was with the utmost concern whoever I spoke to on this affair concluded what they related of her with saying, that so excellent an example of all that was valuable in womankind would shortly be taken from them; that she had long, with an unexampled patience, lingered under a severe illness, which every day threatened dissolution. These accounts made me hesitate no farther. I went boldly to the castle, asked to speak with the Lord M., who received me with a politeness befitting his quality. I told him that my curiosity of seeing foreign countries had brought me to Ireland, and being in my tour through those parts, I took the liberty of calling at his seat, having formerly had the honour of being known to his lady when at her father's house, and whom I now heard, to my great concern, was indisposed, otherwise have been glad to pay my respects to her. The nobleman answered with tears in his eyes, that she was indeed in a condition such as gave no hope of her recovery, but that she sometimes saw company, though obliged to receive them in bed, having lost the use of her limbs, and would perhaps be glad of the visit of a person she had known so long. On this I told him my name, which he immediately went in, and her woman not long after came from her to let me know she would admit me. My lord went in with me, and to countenance what I said, I accosted her with the freedom of a person who had been acquainted when children, spoke of her father as of a gentleman who had favoured me with his good will, though in reality I had never seen him in my life, but remembered well enough what she had mentioned to me concerning him, and some others of her family, to talk as if I had been intimate among them. I could perceive she was very well pleased with the method I had taken of introducing myself, and to prevent any suspicion that I had any other business with her than to pay my compliments, made my visit very short that day, not doubting but she would of herself contrive some means of entertaining me without witnesses, as she easily found. Her lord had desired I would make the castle my home when I stayed in that part of the country. I was not deceived. The next morning, having been told her lord was engaged with his steward, she sent for me, and making some pretence for getting rid of her woman, she plucked a paper from under her pillow, and putting it into my hand, in that, said, you will find the secret I mentioned in my letter. Suspect not the veracity of it, I conjure you, nor love the unfortunate Horatio and Louisa less, for their being mine. I cannot express the confusion I was in, continued Dorilaus, at her mentioning you and your brother, but I had no opportunity of asking any questions. Her woman that instant returned, after which I stayed but a short time, being impatient to examine the contents, which, as near as I can remember, were to this purpose. You were scarce out of France before I discovered our amour had produced such consequences as, had my too fond passion given me leave to think of, I never should have hazarded. I will not repeat the distraction I was in, you may easily judge of it. I communicated the misfortune to my nurse, who, you know, I told you, went from England with me, and has often brought you messages from the convent. The faithful creature did her utmost to console me for an evil which was without a remedy. To complete my confusion, my father commanded me home. My lord M. was returned from his travels. We were both of an age to marry, and it was resolved by our parents no longer to defer the completion of an affair long before agreed upon. I was ready to lay violent hands on myself, since there seemed no way to conceal my shame. But my good nurse, having set all her wits to work for me, found out an expedient which served me, when I could think of nothing for myself. She bid me be of comfort, that she thought being sent for home was the luckiest thing that could have happened, since nothing could be so bad as to have my pregnancy discovered in the convent, as it infallibly must have been had I stayed a very little time longer. She also assured me she would contrive it so as to keep the thing a secret from all the world. I found afterwards she did not deceive me by vain promises. We left Paris, according to my father's order, and came by easy journeys, befitting my condition, to Calais, and embarked on board the packet for Dover, but then, instead of taking coach for London, hired a chariot, and went cross the country to a little village, where a kinswoman of my nurse's lived. With these people I remained till Horatio and Louisa came into the world. I could have had them nursed at that place, but I feared some discovery through the miscarriage of letters, which often happens, and which could not have been avoided being sent on such occasions. So we contrived together that my good confidant and adviser should carry them to your house, and commit the care of them to you, who, equal with myself, had a right to it. She found means, by bribing a man that worked under your gardener, to convey them where I afterwards heard you found and received them as I could wish, and becoming the generosity of your nature. I then took coach for London, pretending at my arrival that I had been delayed by sickness, and to excuse my nurse's absence, said she had caught the fever of me. So no farther inquiry was made, and I soon after was married to a man whose worth is well deserving of a better wife, though I have endeavoured to atone for my unknown transgression by every act of duty in my power. Nurse stayed long enough in your part of the world to be able to bring me an account of how the children were disposed of. That I never gave you an account they were your own was occasioned by two reasons. First, the danger of entrusting such a thing by the post, my nurse soon after dying, and secondly, because as I was a wife, I thought it unbecoming of me to remind you of a passage I was willing to forget myself. A long sickness has put other thoughts into my head, and inspired me with a tenderness for those unhappy babes, which the shame of being their mother hitherto deprived them of. I hear with pleasure that you are not married, and are therefore at full liberty to make some provision for them, if they are yet living, that may alleviate the misfortune of their birth. Farewell. If I obtain this first and last request, I shall die well satisfied. P.S. Burn this paper, I conjure you, the moment you have read it, but lay the contents of it up in your heart, never to be forgotten. I now no longer wondered, pursued Dorilaus, at that impulse I had to love you. I found it in the sympathy of nature, and adored the divine power. After having well fixed in my mind all the particulars of this amazing secret, I performed her injunction and committed it to the flames. I had opportunity enough to inform her in what manner Horatio had disposed of himself, and let her know you were gone with a lady on her travels. I concealed indeed the motive, fearing to give her any occasion of reproaching herself for having so long concealed what my ignorance of might have involved us all in guilt and ruin. I stayed some few days at the castle, and then took my leave. She said many tender things at parting concerning you, and seemed well satisfied with the assurances I gave her of making the same provision for you, as I must have done, had the ceremony of the church obliged me to it. This seemed indeed the only thing for which she lived, and I was informed, died in a few days after. At my return to England, I renewed my endeavours to discover where you were, but could hear nothing since you wrote from Aix la Chapelle, and was equally troubled that I had received no letters from your brother. I doubted not but he had fallen in the battle, and mourned him as lost, till an old servant, perceiving the melancholy I was in, acquainted me that several letters had been left at my house by the post during my absence, but that the kinsman I had left to take care of my affairs had secreted them, jealous no doubt of the fondness I have expressed for him. This so enraged me, when on examination I had too much reason to be assured of his treachery, that I turned my whole estate into ready money, and resolved to quit England for ever, and pass my life here, this being a country I have always loved, and had many reasons to dislike my own. Here I soon heard news of my Horatio, and such as filled me with a pleasure which wanted nothing of being complete, but the presence of my dear Louisa to partake of it. Dorilaus then went on, and acquainted her with the particulars of Horatio's story, as he had learned it from the Baron de Palfoy, with whom he now was very intimate. But as the reader is sufficiently informed of those transactions, it would be needless to repeat them, so I shall only say that Dorilaus arrived in France in a short time after Horatio had left it to enter into the service of the King of Sweden, and had wrote that letter, inserted in the 18th chapter, in order to engage that young warrior to return, some little time before his meeting with Louisa. Nothing now was wanting to the contentment of this tender father but the presence of Horatio, which he was every day expecting, when instead of himself those letters from him arrived which contained his resolution of remaining with Charles XII till the conquests he was in pursuit of should be accomplished. This was some matter of affliction to Dorilaus, though in his heart he could not but approve those principles of honour which detained him. Neither the Baron de Palfoy nor Charlotta herself could say he could well have acted otherwise, and used their utmost endeavours to comfort a father in his anxieties for the safety of so valuable a son. Louisa was also very much troubled at being disappointed in her hope of embracing a brother whom she had ever dearly loved, and was now more precious to her than ever by the proofs she had heard he had given of his courage and his virtue. But she had another secret and more poignant grief that preyed upon her soul, and could scarce receive any addition from aught beside. She had been now near 2 months in Paris, yet could hear nothing of Monsieur de Plessis, but that by the death of his father a large estate had devolved on him, which he had never come to claim, or had been at Paris for about 18 months, so that she had all the reason in the world to believe he was no more. This threw her into a melancholy which was so much the more severe as she endeavoured to conceal it. She made use of all her efforts to support the loss of a person she so much loved, and who proved himself so deserving of that love. She represented to herself that, being relieved from all the snares and miseries of an indigent life, raised from an obscurity which had given her many bitter pangs, to a station equal to her wishes, and under the care of the most indulgent and best of fathers, she ought not to repine, but bless the bounty of heaven, who had bestowed on her so many blessings, and withheld only one she could have asked. These, I say, were the dictates of reason and religion, but the tender passion was not always to be silenced by them, and whenever she was alone, the tears in spite of herself would flow, and she, without even knowing why she did so, cry out, "Oh, du Plessis, wherefore do I live since thou art dead?" Among the many acquaintance she soon contracted at Paris, there was none she so much esteemed, both on the account of her own merit and the regard she had for Horatio, as mademoiselle du Palfoy. In this young lady's society did she find more charms for her grief than in that of any other, and the other truly loving her, not only because she found nothing more worthy of being loved, but because she was the sister of Horatio, they were very seldom asunder. Louisa was one day at the baron's, enjoying the satisfaction which the conversation of his beautiful daughter never failed to afford, when word was brought that madame, the Countess d'Espargnes, was come to visit her. Mademoiselle Charlotta ran to receive her with a great deal of joy, she being a lady she very much regarded, and who she had not seen of a long time. She immediately returned, leading a lady in deep mourning, who seemed not to be above 25, was extremely handsome, and had besides something in her air that attached Louisa at first sight. Mademoiselle Charlotta presented her to the countess, saying at the same time, "See, madam, the only rival you have in my esteem." "You do well to give me one," replied the countess, "who looks as if she would make me love her as well as you, and so I should be even with you." With these words she opened her arms to embrace Louisa, who returned the compliment with equal politeness. When they were seated, mademoiselle Charlotta began to express the pleasure she had in seeing her in Paris, on which the countess told her that the affair she came upon was so disagreeable, that nothing but the happiness of enjoying her company while she stayed could atone for it. "You know, my dear," continued Madame d'Espargnes, "I was always an enemy to anything that had the face of business, yet am I now, against my will, involved in it by as odd an adventure as perhaps you ever heard." Charlotta testifying some desire to be informed of what nature, the other immediately satisfied her curiosity in this manner. "You know," said she, "that on the late death of my father, his estate devolved on my brother, an officer in those troops in Italy, commanded by the Prince of Conti. Some wounds, which were looked upon as extremely dangerous, obliged him, when the campaign was over, to continue in his winter quarters, on which he sent to monsieur the count to take possession in his name. This was done, but an intricate affair relating to certain sums lodged in a person's hand, and to be brought before the parliament of Paris, could not be decided without the presence either of him or myself, who had been witness of the transaction. I was extremely loath to take so long a journey, being then in very ill health, and hearing he was recovered, delayed it, as we then expected him in person. I sent a special messenger, however, in order to hasten his return, but instead of complying with my desires, I received a letter from him, acquainting me that a business of more moment to him than any thing in my power to guess at, required his presence in another place, and insisted by all the tenderness which had ever been between us, that I would take on myself the management of this affair. To enable me the better to do it, he sent me a deed of trust to act as I should find it most expedient. As he did not let me into the secret of what motives detained him at so critical a juncture, I was at first very much surprised, but on asking some questions of the messenger I had sent to him, I soon discovered what it was. He told me that on arrival he found my brother had left his quarters and was gone to Bologna, on which he followed and overtook him there, that he appeared to the utmost discontent, and was just preparing to proceed to Leghorn, but did not mention to him any more than he did in his letter to me what inducement he had to this journey. His servant, however, told him privately that the mystery was this, that being passionately in love with a young English lady, whom he had placed in a monastery at Bologna, and expected to find there at his return, she had in his absence departed without having acquainted him with her design, and that supposing she was gone for England, and unable to live without her, his intention was to take shipping for that country, and make use of his utmost efforts to find her out. I must confess, pursued the beautiful countess, this piece of quixotism very much vexed me. I thought his friends in France deserved more from him than to be neglected for one who had fled from him, and who, as the man said, he knew not whether he should ever be able to see again. I resolved, however, to comply with his desires, and came immediately to Paris, but heaven has shewed him how little it approves his giving me this unnecessary trouble, for this morning I received a letter from him, that meeting with robbers in his way, they had taken from him all his money and bills of exchange, besides wounding him in several places, so that he cannot proceed on his journey till his hurts, which it seems are not dangerous, are cured, and he has fresh remittances from hence. With what emotions the heart of Louisa was agitated during the latter part of this little narrative, a sensible reader may easily conceive. From the first mention of Bologna, where there was no other English pensioner than herself, she knew it must be no other than her dear du Plessis, who was in search for her abroad, while she was vainly hoping to find him at home. Every circumstance rendered this belief more certain, and surprise and joy worked so strongly in her, that fearing the effects would be visible, she rose up and withdrew to a window. Mademoiselle Charlotta, who knew she could not be capable of such an act of unpoliteness without being compelled to it, asked if she were not well, on which Louisa entreated pardon, but owned a sudden faintness had come over her spirits, so that she was obliged to be rude, in order to prevent being troublesome. As Mademoiselle Charlotta knew nothing of her story, she had no farther thought on it than of some little qualm, which frequently happens when young ladies are too closely laced, and she seeming perfectly recovered from, the conversation was renewed on the same subject it had turned upon before this interruption, and the name of Monsieur du Plessis often being mentioned, confirmed Louisa, if before she could have had the least remains of doubt, that it was her lover, who, neglectful of his own affairs, and the remonstrances of his expecting friends, was about to range in search of one who, he imagined, was ungrateful both to his love and friendship. After having listened with the utmost attention to all the countess said of him, and other matters becoming the topic of discourse, she took her leave, in order to reflect alone what she ought to do in this affair. She debated not long within herself before she resolved to write to him, and prevent the unprofitable journey he was about to take, and having heard by Madame d'Espargnes the name of the village where he was obliged to wait, both for the recovery of his wounds and for remittances for his expenses, she wrote to him in the following terms. To Monsieur du Plessis, I should ill return the proofs I have received of your generous, disinterested friendship, to delay one moment that I had it in my power in endeavouring to convince you that it was a quite contrary motive than ingratitude to you that carried me from Bologna. But the story is too long for the compass of a letter. When you know it, you will perhaps own this action, whatever you may now think of it, merits more than anything I could have done your approbation. This seeming riddle will be easily expounded if, On the recovery of your wounds, you repair immediately to Paris, where you will find your much obliged Louisa. Having finished this little billet, a scruple rose in her head, that being now under the care of a father, she ought not to do any thing of this nature without his permission. She had already told him how greatly she had been indebted to du Plessis for his honourable passion, but had not mentioned the least tittle of the tender impressions it had made on her, and she so lately knew him to be her father, that she was ashamed to make him the confidant of an affair of this nature. But then, when she considered the quality of du Plessis, which she was now confirmed of, and the sense Dorilaus testified he had of his behaviour to her, while he believed her so infinitely his inferior, made her resolve to drain her modesty so far as to inform him of all. She began by relating her accidental meeting with Madame the Countess d'Espargnes, and the conversation that passed at Mademoiselle du Palfoy's, and then, though not without immoderate blushes, shewed him what she had wrote, and beseeched him to let her know whether it would be consistent with a virgin's modesty, and also agreeable to his pleasure, that she give this demonstration of her gratitude for the favours she had received from this young gentleman. Dorilaus was charmed with this proof of her duty and respect, and told her that he was so far from disapproving what she had wrote, that had she omitted it, or said less than she did, he should have looked upon her as unworthy of so perfect a passion as that which monsieur de Plessis on all occasions testified for her; that in his opinion she owed him more than she could ever pay, and that it should be his endeavour to shew he had not placed his affections on the daughter of one who knew not how to set a just value on merits such as his. He made her also add a postscript to the letter, to give a direction in what part of Paris he might find her on his arrival. But Louisa would by no means give the least hint of the alteration in her circumstances, not that she wanted any farther proofs of his sincerity, but that she reserved the pleasure of so agreeable a surprize to their meeting. This letter was dispatched immediately, to the end that he might receive it at least as soon as that from his sister, with the expected remittances. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Fortunate Foundlings, by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 25. Monsieur de Plessis arrives at Paris. His reception from Dorilaus and Louisa. The marriage of these lovers agreed upon. The innocent pleasure Louisa felt in picturing to herself the ecstasy which du Plessis would be in at the receipt of her letter was not a flattering idea. To know she was in Paris, where in all probability she had come to seek him, and to have the intelligence of it from herself, had all the effect on him that the most raptured fancy can invent. His orders to Madame d'Espargnes being punctually complied with, his bills of exchange also came soon after to hand, and the little hurts he had received from the robbers, as well as those of his mind, being perfectly healed, he set out with a lover's expedition, and arrived in Paris, to the pleasing surprise of a sister who tenderly loved him, and expected not this satisfaction of a long time. He took but one night's repose before he inquired concerning Dorilaus, and was told that he was a person of quality in England, but on some disgust he had received in his native country, was come to settle in France. As Louisa was extremely admired, they told him also that he had a very beautiful daughter, of whom he was extremely fond. This last information gave not a little ease to the mind of him who heard it, and dissipated those apprehensions which the high character they gave of Dorilaus had, in spite of himself, excited in him. He now imagined that as they were English, his Louisa might possibly have been acquainted with a daughter of this gentleman in their own country, and meeting her at Paris, might have put herself under her protection. Full of those impatiencies which are inseparable from a sincere passion, he borrowed his sister's chariot, and went to the Faubourg St. Germain, and being told one of the best houses in the place was that of Dorilaus, he asked for mademoiselle Louisa, on which he was desired to alight, and shewed into a handsome parlour, while a servant went in to inform her. After this he was ushered up stairs into a room, the furniture of which shewed the elegance of the owner's taste; but accustomed to everything that was great and magnificent, the gilded scenes, the rich tapestry, the pictures, had no effect on him, till casting his eyes on one that hung over the chimney, he found the exact resemblance of the dear object never absent from his heart. It was indeed the picture of Louisa, which her father, soon after her arrival, had caused to be drawn by one of the best painters at that time in Paris. This sight gave him a double pleasure, because it, in some measure, anticipated that of the original, and also convinced him that she was not indifferent to the person she was with. He was fixed in contemplation on this delightful copy, when the original appeared in all the advantages that jewels and rich dress could give her. Though he loved her only for herself, and nothing could add to the sincere respect his heart had always paid her, yet to see her so different from what he expected filled him with a surprize and a kind of enforced awe, which hindered him from giving that loose to his transports which, after so long an absence, might have been very excusable; and he could only say, my dear adorable Louisa, I am so blessed to see you once more. She met his embrace half way, and replied, Monsieur du Plessis, heaven has given me all I had to wish in restoring to me so faithful a friend; but come, continued she, permit me to lead you to a father who longs to embrace the protector of his daughter's innocence. Your father, madam? cried he. Yes, answered she, in seeking a lover at Paris, I found a father. Dorilaus is my father. I have acquainted him with all the particulars of our story, and I believe the sincere affection I have for you will not be less pleasing for receiving his sanction to it. With these words she took his hand, and led him, all astonishment, into an inner room, where Dorilaus was sitting, who rose to meet him with the greatest politeness, and which shewed that to be master of it was not necessary to be born in France; and on Louisa's acquainting him with the name of the person she presented, embraced him with the tenderness of a father, and made him such obliging and affectionate compliments as confirmed to the transported du Plessis the character had been given of him. After the utmost testimonies of respect on both sides, Dorilaus told his daughter she ought to make her excuses to monsieur for having eloped from the monastery where he had been so good as to place her, which, said he, I think you can do in no better a manner than by telling the truth, and as I am already sufficiently acquainted with the whole, will leave you to relate it, while I dispatch a little business that at present calls me hence. He went out of the room in speaking this, and Louisa had a more full opportunity of informing her lover of all she had suffered since their parting till this happy change in her fortune, than she could have had in the presence of her father, though no stranger to her most inmost thoughts on this occasion. The pleasing story of her pilgrimage rehearsed, how did the charmed du Plessis pity and applaud by turns her sufferings and fortitude! How exclaim against the treachery of the abbess and those of the nuns who were in confederacy with her! But his curiosity satisfied in this point, another rose instantly in his mind, that being the daughter of such a person as Dorilaus, wherefore had she made so great a secret of it, and what reason had occasioned her being on the terms she was with Melanthe? He no sooner expressed his wonder on these heads, than having before her father's permission to do so, she resolved to leave him in no suspense on any score relating to her affairs. Though, she said, blushing, I cannot reveal the history of my birth without laying open the errors of those to whom I owe my being, yet I shall not think the sacrifice too great to recompense the obligations you have laid upon me, and then proceeded to acquaint him with everything relating to her parents, as well as to herself, from the first moment she was found in the garden of Dorilaus. It is not to be doubted but that he listened to the story with the utmost attention, in which he found such matters of admiration that he could not forbear frequently interrupting her by crying, O heaven! O Providence, how mysterious are thy ways! How in the disposal of things dost thou force us to acknowledge thy divine power and wisdom! He was also extremely pleased to find she was the sister of Horatio, whom he had often been in company with, both at the Baron de la Valliere's and at St. Germain, and had admired for the many extraordinary qualities he discovered in him. This led him into a conversation concerning that young gentleman, and the misfortunes which some late newspaper gave an account were beginning to fall upon the king of Sweden. After that, renewing the subject of their mutual affection, and du Plessis running over the particulars of their acquaintance in Italy, Louisa asked whether the Count de Bellfleur had ever testified any remorse for the injury he would have offered her, and in what manner they had lived together in the army. To which monsieur de Plessis replied, that the authority of the prince had prevented him from attempting any open acts of violence, but that by his manner of behaviour it was easy to see he had not forgiven the disappointment, and he verily believed wanted only a convenient opportunity to revenge it. But, continued he, whatever his designs were, heaven put a stop to the execution of them; for in the first skirmish that happened between us and the forces of Prince Eugene, this once gay gallant courtier had his head taken off by a cannon ball. The gentle Louisa could not forbear expressing some concern for the sudden fate of this bad man, greatly as she had been affronted by him; but when she reflected that the same accident might have befallen her dear du Plessis, she was all dissolved in tears. They were in this tender communication when Dorilaus returned, leading the Countess d'Espargnes in one hand, and mademoiselle du Palfoy in the other. Monsieur du Plessis was surprised to meet his sister in a place where he knew not she was acquainted, and she no less to find him there. The occasion of it was this. Dorilaus, when he left the lovers together, went directly to the Baron de Palfoy's, and related to him and to mademoiselle the whole history of monsieur du Plessis and Louisa, on which they contrived to make a pleasant scene, by engaging the Countess d'Espargnes to go with them to Dorilaus's, without letting her know on what account. The event answered their wishes. Madame d'Espargnes rallied her brother on finding him alone with so beautiful a young lady, and mademoiselle Charlotta for his inconstancy to his mistress at Bologna. But when the riddle was solved, and the countess came to know that the lady left in the monastery and Louisa were the same, she no longer condemned an attachment which before had given her so much pain. Mademoiselle Charlotta chid her for the reserve she had maintained to her in the affair, especially, said she, as you were obliged to the conversation you had with Madame d'Espargnes in my apartment, that you received any intelligence of monsieur du Plessis, or knew how to direct your commands to him to return. That, madam, is an obligation lies wholly on me, said monsieur du Plessis, and I believe I shall find it very difficult to requite it, any more than I shall to deserve my sister's pardon for so industriously endeavouring to conceal from her the secret of my passion and its object. Louisa told the ladies that she now hoped they would excuse the disorder that she had been in at the countess's discourse, since they knew the motive. A good deal of pleasantry passed between this agreeable company, and as they were in the midst of it, the Baron de Palfoy, who had been hindered from accompanying Dorilaus when he conducted the ladies, now joined them, and though he was considerably older than any there, was no less entertaining and good humoured than the youngest. Dorilaus had privately ordered a very magnificent collation, which being served up, Louisa did the honours of the table with so good a grace that Madame d'Espargnes was charmed with her, and took an opportunity of asking Dorilaus when she might hope the happiness of calling so amiable a lady by the name of sister, Du Plessis thanked her for the interest she took in his affairs, and the Baron de Palfoy added, that as the lovers wanted no farther proofs how worthy they were of each other, he would join in soliciting for a completion of their happiness. To which Dorilaus replied, that he was too well satisfied with his daughter's conduct, not to leave her entirely at her own disposal, and as to what related to fortune and settlement, he should be ready to enter into such articles as he believed monsieur du Plessis would have no reason to complain of. The passionate lover at these words cried out, that it was Louisa's self alone he was ambitious of possessing, nor had either that lady or her father any room to look on what he said as a mere compliment, because his love had long since waived all the seeming disproportion between them. In fine, not only at this time, but every day, almost every hour, was Louisa, as it now depended wholly on herself, importuned by her lover and the Countess d'Espargne to render his happiness complete; but she still delayed it, desiring to hear some news of Horatio. The Baron de Palfoy having settled everything with Dorilaus concerning his marriage with mademoiselle Charlotta, she was willing, she said, that as they were born on the same day, their nuptials should be celebrated also at the same time. Monsieur du Plessis was obliged to content himself with this, since he could obtain no more, and for a time everything passed smoothly and agreeably on. But news after news continually arriving of the king of Sweden's ill success in Ukrainia, rendered all the noble friends of Horatio extremely dissatisfied. The public accounts were too deficient for their information of any particular officer, and as there were very few French in the Swedish army, they could hope for no intelligence of him but from himself, which as he omitted giving, they at last concluded he was either killed or taken prisoner, which last misfortune they looked upon as equal with the former, the Russian barbarity and their manner of treating those whom the chance of war threw into their hands was no secret through all Europe, and whichever of these accidents had happened must be very grievous to a gentleman of Dorilaus's disposition, who, when unknowing he was his son, loved him with more tenderness than many fathers do their offspring, but now convinced not only that he was so, but also that he was possessed of such amiable qualities as might do honour to the most illustrious race, had fixed an idea in his mind of such a lasting happiness in having him near him, that the thoughts of being deprived of him for ever threw him into a melancholy, which not all the friends he had acquired in Paris, not all the gaieties of that place, nor the sweet society of the engaging and dutiful Louisa had the power to console. So deep was his affliction, that monsieur du Plessis, amorous and impatient as he was, had not courage to urge a grant of his own happiness, while those who were to bestow it were incapable of sharing any part of it. Soon after there arrived a thunderclap indeed. Certain intelligence that the once victorious Charles was totally overthrown, his whole army either cut to pieces or taken prisoners, and himself a fugitive in the Grand Signior's dominions. Dorilaus, now not doubting but the worst he feared had come to pass, shut himself from all company, and refused the unavailing comfort of those who came to offer it. The fair eyes of Louisa were continually drowned in tears, and the generous du Plessis sympathized in all her griefs. But what became of mademoiselle Charlotta de Palfoy? Her tender soul, so long accustomed to love Horatio, had not courage to support the shock of losing him at a time when she thought herself secure of being united to him for ever, when his discovered birth had rendered her father's wishes conformable to her own, and there wanted nothing but his presence to render both their families completely blessed. All that excess of love which modesty had hitherto restrained her from giving any public marks of, now shewed itself in the violence of her grief and her despair. She made no secret of her softest inclinations, and gave a loose to all the impatience of a ruined love. Even the haughty baron was melted into tears of compassion, and so far from condemning, that he attempted all in his power to alleviate her sorrows. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 26. The Catastrophe of the Whole. Poor Horatio, released, as I have already said, from his worse than Turkish bondage, had now, with the companions of his misfortunes, left a country where they had suffered so much, and had so little to hope, that their enlargement seemed even to themselves a miracle. As they parted, miserable and forlorn, through those provinces where, about a year before, they had marched with so much pomp and force, as together with the King of Sweden's name, inspired admiration and terror over all those parts of the world, it filled them with the most poignant anguish, and drew tears from those among them least sensible of any tender emotions. All this disconsolate company, except Horatio, being Swedes, they made the best of their way, some to Stockholm and others to Stralsund. Now left alone, a long journey before him, and altogether uncertain what reception he should find at Paris, either from Dorilaus or Mademoiselle Charlotta, his condition was extremely pitiable, and he stood in need of more fortitude than could be expected from his years to enable him to go through it. The nearer he approached Paris, the greater was his shock at the necessity of appearing there in the despicable figure he now made, but his courage still got the better and surmounted all difficulties. If Dorilaus thinks my disobedience to his commands a crime too great to merit his forgiveness, would he say to himself, or Charlotta disdains in his misfortunes the faithful Horatio, I have no more to do than to return to Poland, and seek an honourable death in the service of Stanislaus. He made his entrance into that opulent city through the most byways he could, and concealed himself till towards night in a little cabaret, where, having soon been informed where Dorilaus lived, he went, when it was quite dark, to his house, though how divided between hope and fear it is easy to imagine. He knocked at the gate, which being opened by the porter, and he desiring to speak with his master, was answered with many impertinent questions, as who he came from, what his business was, and such like interrogatories, which the sauciness of servants generally put to persons such as this fellow took Horatio to be by his appearance. But he had no sooner desired he would tell Dorilaus that he came from Russia, and brought intelligence of Horatio, that his tone of voice and behaviour was quite changed. Our traveller was now carried into a parlour, and entreated to sit down, and the late surly porter called hastily for one of the servants, bidding him with the utmost joy run in and inform his master that here was a person come from Russia that could give him news of Colonel Horatio. This a little raised the lately depressed spirits of Horatio, as it assured him that his name was not unknown in that family, nor had been mentioned with indifference. He attended but a very little time before he was shewed up into Dorilaus's apartment, who was just opening his mouth to inquire if Horatio were yet living, and in what condition, when he saw it was himself. Surprise and joy rendered him incapable either of speaking to him, or hearing the apologies he was beginning to make for having disobeyed his commands, and he fell upon his neck, and gave him an embrace which dissipated all Horatio's fears, and left him no room to doubt if his peace was made. No words were exchanged between them for a considerable time, but, oh, my dear son, my ever loved Horatio, on the one side, my more than father, patron, on the other. At length the tumultuous rapture of so unexpected a meeting and reception giving way to a more peaceful calm, Dorilaus made Horatio relate all the particulars had happened to him, and when he had ended, now, said he, I will reward the sincerity I easily perceive you have made use of in this narrative, by acquainting you in my turn with secrets you are far from having any notion of, and which, I believe, will compensate for all your sufferings, and make you own that while you seemed to groan under the utmost severities of fortune, she was preparing for you all the blessings in her power to give, and even more than your ambition aimed at. But I have first a message to dispatch, continued he. At my return you shall know all. With these words he went out of the room, but came back in a moment, and after renewing his embraces to Horatio, revealed to him the whole secret of his birth, with all that had happened to Louisa till the time of their happy meeting in Paris. With what pleasing wonder the soul of Horatio was filled at this discovery is much more easy to conceive than describe, so I shall leave it to the reader's imagination to guess what it was he felt and spoke on so extraordinary an occasion. While he was pouring out the transports it occasioned in the most grateful thanks to heaven and his new-found father, Louisa entered, Dorilaus having sent to the Baron de Palfoy's, where he knew she was, to let her know a messenger from Russia was arrived with news of her brother. They instantly knew each other, though it was upwards of 4 years since they were separated, and in that time the stature of both considerably increased. Nothing could exceed the joy of these amiable twins. Never was felicity more perfect, which yet received addition on Horatio's part, when Louisa told him that it was as much as Charlotta could do to restrain herself from coming with her to hear what account the supposed messenger had brought. Dorilaus on this immediately sent to let her know his son was well, and expected in Paris the next day, for he would not suffer him to appear before her or the baron till a habit was made for him more agreeable to his condition than he had arrived in. It is certain that the impatience of a lover would have made Horatio gladly waive this ceremony, but he would not a second time dispute the commands of his father. But wherefore should I delay the attention of the reader, who I doubt not but easily perceives by this time how things will end? So I shall only say that the meeting of Horatio and Charlotta was such as might be expected from so arduous and constant an affection, that everything having been settled between the two fathers at the time they sent their joint mandates to call him home, there now remained nothing but to celebrate the long desired nuptials, which was deferred no longer than was requisite for preparations to render the ceremony magnificent. The generous du Plessis and his beloved Louisa were also united the same day, and it would be hard to say which of these weddings afforded most satisfaction to the friends on both sides, or were attended with the most happy consequences for the persons concerned in them. By these examples we may learn, that to sustain with fortitude and patience whatever ills we are preordained to suffer, entitles us to relief, while by impatient struggling we should but augment the score, and provoke fate to show us the vanity of all attempts to frustrate its decrees. Finis. End of chapter 26. End of The Fortunate Foundlings by Eliza Haywood.